Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Israel says it has struck around 800 Hezbollah targets across Lebanon, where the health ministry says more than 274 people have been killed. More than 1,000 others have been injured. The Pentagon says the US is sending additional troops to the Middle East in the context of the sharp spike in violence between Israel and Hezbollah. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in the United States, where he's set to unveil a plan aimed at ending the war with Russia. And more than 140 world leaders descend on New York for the annual UN General Assembly. This amidst growing calls for the global body to reform. Very warm welcome to you. We begin in Lebanon, where the country's health ministry says 274 people have been killed today alone in a wave of Israeli airstrikes. Well, in addition to these deaths, which included 21 children, 39 women and medics, more than 1,000 other people have been injured. Well, after nearly a year of war in Gaza, Israel has begun shifting its focus to its northern border, where Hezbollah has been firing rockets throughout the course of the day into Israel, this in support of its ally Hamas. Well, the Israeli military says it is increasing the scope of its airstrikes, and there are growing concerns that a full-blown war could break out. Meanwhile, throughout the course of today, Lebanese mobile phones have been receiving automated messages and calls warning citizens to evacuate their areas. Well, in a bid to support those who've been displaced, schools are being made available for those people who are in need of shelter. Well, during the last hour or so, the US announced that it is going to be sending additional troops to the Middle East, this in the context of the spike in violence between Israel and Hezbollah. Well, let's get the latest from the Lebanese capital now. We can cross the journalist Hannah Davis, who joins us now from Beirut. Hannah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Let's start by talking about the apparent focus of the Israeli strikes. Which areas have been targeted, and what is the situation like in those places?
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. So right now, this has been the heaviest Israeli bombardment in Lebanon since the fighting started between Hezbollah and Israel on October 8th in the country. So we've seen Israel targeting throughout the entire country, throughout all of Lebanon. They've been hitting heavily in the south. They've been hitting in the east, in the eastern Bekaa Valley. They also, for the first time, hit the Mount Lebanon district in the north of Lebanon, which is about 1,000 kilometers from the border. So the airstrikes are very severe. They're causing a lot of damage to civilian infrastructure. Israel says that they are targeting Hezbollah military targets. However, we have seen already, as you said earlier, hundreds of civilian casualties, and thousands have been injured. Reports from people I know in the south, they're saying that infrastructure has been destroyed, bridges have been destroyed, roads have been destroyed, many people's homes have been destroyed. So this has caused a mass exodus of people to flee the south. So earlier this morning, we saw the South Lebanon highway was packed with cars, while in videos you can see Israeli airstrikes going off around them. There were thousands of people trying to flee, trying to find safety in the north. We also saw today, about an hour ago, Israel reportedly targeted the southern suburbs of Dahieh, commonly known as Dahieh again. This was the second time Israel has struck the southern suburbs this week. So they struck the suburbs on Friday, targeting head Hezbollah commanders and operatives who were meeting in the residential building. This led to over 50 deaths and hundreds more injured. They're still searching for missing in the rubble. So, and today, as you said, it's been mass casualties, mass injuries. So really in Lebanon now, in Beirut, across the country, we're seeing a huge sense of panic, a huge sense of fright. a huge sense of exhaustion. People are trying to get in contact with their relatives. They're trying to find homes, trying to find places for people. Notably in Lebanon, it's not that they don't have the advanced air defense systems that Israel has. They don't have sirens to warn civilians when there's an attack. Displaced many people in the south don't have a place to go. They don't have money. They don't have families. So there's been a collective effort in Beirut, to reach out to people who have been displaced, to offer their homes. But surely we'll see many people without a place to go, stuck either in the south or, in a shelter in Beirut without a place. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And I just wanted to ask you about the warnings people are being given, because we've heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu telling Lebanese citizens to get out of harm's way. He's saying evacuate to safety. I just want to ask you about the evacuation process and these calls to civilians to leave a certain area. They've been getting messages on their mobile phones. Are these warnings realistic? And have these people got places they can actually go to that will be safe?
Yeah, well, to answer, first of all, the first part of your question, these warnings, it's unclear. The Lebanese information minister reported today that there were thousands of reports of people in Beirut and across the country receiving these warnings to evacuate their homes and their offices. The Lebanese culture minister, he received a warning to leave his office immediately. However, they've announced these warnings may not be real, they may not be legit. So people are not, these warnings from the unknown numbers on the callers, people are not evacuating from these warnings. However, as I said earlier, many people are fleeing the south en masse, looking for places to go. And in response to your second question, as I said, many people will not have a place to go. Even months ago, the displacement shelters in Lebanon were already overcrowded and they were already under-resourced. The Lebanese government has been suffering from a financial crisis since 2019. So there are just simply not enough resources to help the thousands who have been displaced and who are in need of food, of blankets, of shelter. It's a severe humanitarian crisis and situation. And, people don't have work, they don't have jobs, many don't have income. For some, they don't even have the money to leave the south. They can't even afford transportation to get out of the bombardment. So they're waiting it out, which unfortunately, Israel has promised to do whatever it can to return the residents in the north of Israel. So we're likely to see this escalating, and we're likely to see more casualties, more civilian casualties, and more damage, and more people who are displaced without the resources to help them, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Journalist Hannah Davis in Beirut, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's get the latest from the other side of the border. We can speak now to Sarah Coates, who joins us from Tel Aviv. Sarah, I'd just like to ask you, picking up on some of what we've been hearing there from Beirut, about what Israel is saying about its airstrikes on Lebanon and why it's targeting the areas it's targeting.
Certainly. The Israeli military considers these areas to be Hezbollah strongholds and has come out to say that it's hitting homes, that Hezbollah uses civilian homes to store weapons, accusing Hezbollah of using civilians to hide behind. Now, we have heard from the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant throughout the course of the day, but he has just come out his office to say that over the course of the day, through these hundreds of strikes that have been carried out on both the south of Lebanon and also the Bekaa Valley, that half of Hezbollah's medium and short-range rockets have been destroyed, with Yoav Gallant adding that the IDF is crushing Hezbollah infrastructure that's been built up for decades, saying that the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, now remains alone. But what we do need to remember here is the amount of pressure that the Israeli government, including Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has been under to return these some 60,000 internally displaced Israeli residents back to the north. They've been demanding that the security situation change, that the status quo needs to change for them to return home, and for these Hezbollah fighters and personnel to be pushed further back behind the Litani River so they can once again come home.
I mean, what are people saying there about the Israeli military strategy here? Are we going to be looking at purely airstrikes that we've seen up until this point? Or do you think, is there word that perhaps Israel could be planning a ground invasion?
That remains unclear at this hour. We have heard from the Israeli spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, a little earlier today. He said that right now Israel is focusing on this aerial campaign, trying to wipe out Hezbollah's capabilities to fire rockets into Israel. But of course, that ground operation has not been ruled out. There have been many reports of a number of troops being moved to this northern border. And we do know that the Israeli military has drawn up and also approved a plan for the north when it comes to a ground operation. So certainly this is on the cards, and this is potentially one of the other reasons that the Pentagon has announced over the past hour or so that it is deploying additional troops to the region, really fearing potential further escalation than what we've seen over the past day. So certainly this is very worrying. But in terms of Israel's strategy, there has been a lot of criticism over what this has been looking like over the past few months. Israel's been criticised over its strategy in Gaza, many people saying that there is no strategy, and also in the north. And this is potentially why we are really seeing such a heavy bombardment from Israeli forces over the past day of these southern and also eastern parts of Lebanon, really trying to prove something here, that Israel does have control of the situation.
And with regards to the dozens of rockets and missiles that have been fired by Hezbollah into northern Israel, do you get the impression that the majority of them are being intercepted? Because, of course, Israel has this Iron Dome system. Are some of them getting through? And what's the scale of the damage being inflicted on the Israeli side of the border?
Certainly some of these rockets, these missiles are getting through. We've seen many pictures circulating on social media showing direct hits, some of these in the West Bank, some of these in the northern parts of the country. And of course, with the sheer amount of rockets that have been fired by Hezbollah over the past day, the Iron Dome has been somewhat overwhelmed in many parts, simply due to the number of rockets in these barrages that have been sent over. So one thing that I've been hearing really from a lot of analysts over the last few months when I've been talking to them in these northern regions is they have been talking about the potential prospect of what we're seeing now, saying that it would have mass casualties on both sides, the Lebanese side and the Israeli side, simply due to the fact that Hezbollah is believed to have some 150,000 rockets. Many of them can reach very, very deep inside Israel. And we do understand that many of these long-range rockets have not been used yet today. So this, of course, is very worrying to Israeli officials who are really battling to keep up and try and defend Israel with the sheer amount of missiles that have been fired over.
Let's talk about what's happening in Gaza. Reports today that Israeli airstrikes killed 8 Palestinians this morning. That was in central Gaza. Amongst the dead reported to be 5 children. Just tell us what the situation is across Gaza right now.
Well, certainly a lot of attention has been focused away from Gaza over the past few weeks, but what we do know is that these airstrikes are continuing. Now, we are talking about an absolutely dire situation for these people on the ground. They've been battling through extremely hot temperatures. It gets extremely hot, as you would know, being there where you are in this part of the world over summer. And this morning, the rain began to fall. These tents that people have been sheltering in, as we know, they've been displaced, many of them from their homes. They were inundated with water this morning. So now these people are not only battling being away from their homes, but now they're in these tents with little possessions that they have, and they are being inundated with water. So once again, it's an absolutely dire situation for the people on the ground. And we are hearing reports now that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is potentially planning a siege on the north of the Strip in a bid to try and isolate any Hamas fighters that may actually be left in these northern regions. The plan is that we are hearing that he may actually give anyone in the north of the Strip a week to vacate, and after that it would be declared a military zone, and Israel would stop any kind of humanitarian aid from going into that northern part to try and once again lay siege to these people, and then potentially use this as a way of forcing the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, to the negotiating table to see a ceasefire deal and the release of these hostages. But once again, Netanyahu, he is coming under a lot of criticism for blocking a deal, although he says that he simply is not doing that.
OK, and just lastly, reports of electricity outages across the Golan Heights. That's because towns there have been targeted by Hezbollah missiles. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we do understand that 2 municipalities are facing power outages in the north, and this is really something that Israeli authorities have been saying that they've been working on for these past few weeks, anticipating a situation such as this. But this is, as I do understand, confined to a couple of northern areas. No such thing here in Tel Aviv, where I am, but this is, of course, a big concern for Israeli authorities. They've really been trying to shore up plans over these past few weeks, as I mentioned, on all of these electrical infrastructure plans to try and make sure that there is not an event where hospitals go out of action, many other, large structures go out of action, which would cause a lot of panic and really a frenzy around the country. So certainly these are initial reports I'm hearing for these energy outages in the north. But of course, we will continue to bring you more information as it comes to hand.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for that update from Tel Aviv. Sarah Coates, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring you some other news stories we're following for you now. At least 7 people have died in Japan after heavy rain triggered flooding and landslides across the central prefecture of Ishikawa. This is the latest disaster to strike this area of Japan, which is still recovering from a massive, deadly earthquake at the start of the year. 2 people are missing there, and many houses are reported to be without power. Sri Lanka's new president took office today. That man is Anua Kamara-Dissanayake. The Marxist-leaning politician was voted in on an anti-corruption ticket and promises to breathe new life into the country's fragile economy. There have been violent clashes in Bolivia between rival factions. On one side, supporters of President Luis Arce and his government. On the other side, protesters who are loyal to the former president, Evo Morales. Well, in the city of El Alto, the 2 sides threw firecrackers, homemade explosives and stones at each other. And this violence comes just ahead of next year's presidential election. Some business news stories we're following for you now. Washington is toughening its approach to Beijing, and a US ban is being weighed on the sale of connected and self-driving cars. These in particular that are equipped with Chinese and Russian software and hardware. Well, the US Department of Commerce cited national security as being the reason for this ban, which would effectively bar Chinese cars from entering the US market. The US and India have reached an agreement to set up a semiconductor plant in the world's most populous nation. The announcement followed talks during the weekend between the US President Joe Biden and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Well, New Delhi is keen to position the country as being an alternative supplier to China. Elon Musk has warned that another Democratic presidency would, and I quote, destroy the Mars program and doom humanity. The billionaire owner of SpaceX says that growing levels of bureaucracy are stifling the space program. Well, the Republican candidate Donald Trump, whom Musk supports, has promised to support the goal of reaching Mars. The UN General Assembly is now underway in New York, and it is the first such gathering since last year's 7th of October attack in Israel, which triggered the war in Gaza and now an uptick of violence in Lebanon. Well, as well as discussing these specific issues during the course of the week, there are growing calls for the UN to reform as public perception of the international body has become increasingly pessimistic. Our correspondent Mitch McCann filed this report.
It's the biggest week on the UN calendar. World leaders, government officials, all descending on New York to meet and to speak in front of the world. But even those who watch High Level Week closely are sceptical it will achieve anything.
I think at its best, UNGA is an opportunity for states who have problems with one another to avoid shooting each other and to actually come together and discuss global issues that challenge humanity. But it can often just end up a festival of bloviation.
Bloviating meaning empty, pompous political speeches. Simon Adams' view isn't a unique one, but it comes at a critical time. Right now, discussions are underway about adding more permanent members to the powerful UN Security Council, something likely to be front of mind for many nations in New York this week.
I think the fact that the UN Security Council is kind of unable to have any meaningful role in solving, the four biggest conflicts in the world at the moment, Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar and Sudan, casts like a dark shadow over the entire UN and causes people to lose faith in the future of the UN.
The US has voiced support for 2 permanent seats for African nations and another seat to be rotated among island developing states. But don't expect any new members to usher in radical change at the Security Council.
Now, that is a political lunacy, for want of a better word, or a pipe dream, political pipe dream, because that is not how the council works. And everybody knows that. But what would be the difference is that you would actually have a more representative council.
With world leaders arriving here, it's 2 US politicians everyone will be looking out for. With the world's media in New York, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris may choose to show up.
The US is critical to the future of the UN, an international body doing its best to remain relevant when some, including political leaders, are questioning its worth.
The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, is in the United States, where he is due to present a plan aimed at ending the war with Russia. Well, during his visit, President Zelensky will be holding talks with President Joe Biden, as well as the 2 other presidential hopefuls, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Well, one of the main messages the Ukrainian leader will be bringing with him is for his country to be given more weapons. And with that in mind, he visited a munitions factory in Pennsylvania during the weekend, which produces crucially important artillery shells. For more, I'm joined from Kyiv by the Ukrainian MP for the Holos party, Lesia Vasylenko. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Your president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is in the United States. He's expected to present this victory plan aimed at ending the war. What's in this plan?
Unfortunately, the only person who knows about this plan is Volodymyr Zelensky and by now President Biden. This was the condition of making this victory plan work, that first and foremost it will be disclosed to the US president.
Okay, so details of the plan, top secret. We do know, however, that Volodymyr Zelensky, your president, will be meeting the US President Joe Biden. He'll also be meeting Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Overall, what sort of a welcome do you think he's getting there in the United States compared to other visits he's made in the past?
At this present moment, it is critical to harness further support for Ukraine. So we are very hopeful in Ukraine that the president of Ukraine will still be welcomed warmly, with the full understanding that Ukraine is a critical pivot to global defense and security.
And what sort of a difference do you think it makes in President Zelensky's mind? Which one of the two White House hopefuls comes out as the next president?
It doesn't make a difference for us Ukrainians. For us, it is crucial to make sure that there is a bipartisan support coming from both parties, and not just from the political circles, but also from civil society, from the lay American, as well as from the American business, especially the companies that are producing military supplies, that are producing weapons. And this is what our diplomatic circles, our diplomats, our ambassadors is working towards. And this is what President Zelensky is working towards. This is exactly why he is meeting not just President Biden, but also the two presidential candidates from both parties.
But don't you think that perhaps there's a sense in Kyiv that more of the same and continuity in the form of the Harris presidency versus the Trump presidency would be a preferred scenario?
Our preferred scenario is for the next US president to have full realization of the situation on the ground in Ukraine, and to realize also that without Ukraine, there cannot be renewed global peace and long-term stability in the world. And as long as the next US president has full awareness of this and is ready to act upon ensuring global peace and security and pushing back on autocracy, the autocracy being at this moment Russia as the biggest threat to the growing of autocratic regimes in the world, then we're good.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasylenko, thank you very much for speaking to us. Let's go back to our correspondent Mitch McCann, who filed that report we saw a little earlier on the UN General Assembly. And we can cross to New York and speak to Mitch now. Mitch, I've got lots of things I wanted to talk to you about. That news just into us, though, that the United States is going to be sending additional troops to the Middle East. What more can you tell us about this decision?
Yeah, good afternoon from New York. That news only coming out of the Pentagon in the last couple of hours, and it really comes amid a time of rising tensions in the Middle Eastern region, as you've just been covering. Of course, in the last 24 hours, it's been reported up to 270 people have died inside Lebanon as a result of those Israeli strikes, and that follows number of strikes over the last week, including the incident last week that involved exploding pages and two-way radios, something that Israel is yet to claim responsibility for. But the Pentagon has announced in the last couple of hours, as you mentioned, that more troops from the United States are going to be heading to that region, quote, out of an abundance of caution. Now, Major General Pat Ryder at the Pentagon said this morning that would be happening, but didn't say how many troops would be going or what their focus would be in the Middle East. And they are joining, according to the Associated Press, 40,000 US troops already in the region at the moment, amid fears of an all-out war in the region. So the US really taking this seriously by announcing more troops heading there in the coming hours.
Right, now you're at the, it looks like you're at the UN headquarters there, where, of course, the UN General Assembly is getting underway. And this is the first General Assembly since the 7th of October attacks. I mean, there's going to be a pretty long list, isn't there, of geopolitical issues to be discussed. I mean, hard to know even where they're going to begin.
Well, that's right. It's at a critical time with the duties, but it also at a critical. You know, there's three major wars raging around the world at the moment: in Gaza, in Ukraine, and also Sudan. Now, Sudan and Ukraine were discussed, of course, but this is the first war, first United Nations General Assembly since the war in Gaza started. The key theme among many speeches at the General Assembly in the coming days, and working out how the UN can help solve any of these crises, if at all. as I mentioned, it's also a critical time for the United Nations. It's reported in the New York Times this morning that 220 workers from the UN have died carrying out humanitarian duties in Gaza in the last year. At the same time, the UN is under-resourced in many areas. It hopes to carry out humanitarian work around the world. So it's running out of money, and a number of its staff have been affected by these crises as well. So there's a lot to discuss, and that General Assembly debate starts tomorrow morning. But at the moment, we've been hearing from speakers talking about the Summit of the Future, a critical summit talking about and really going forward.
Okay, Mitch, we're going to have to leave it there because we've taken a couple of hits on the satellite connection there. Apologies to our viewers for the unstable connection there with our correspondent in New York, Mitch McCann. Thank you very much indeed. Let's get a quick reminder of our top stories here on Al Arabiya News. Israel says it has struck around 800 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. The country's health ministry says more than 274 people have been killed and more than 1,000 others have been injured. The Pentagon says the US is sending additional troops to the Middle East in the context of this sharp spike in violence between Israel and Hezbollah. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in the United States, where he's due to unveil a plan aimed at ending the war with Russia. And more than 140 world leaders have descended on New York for the annual UN General Assembly. It's amidst growing calls for the global body to reform. That's all we have time for today's News Bulletin. Up next is Hadley Gamble, and then at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and decision makers. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned if you can.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
David Davis, thank you so much for joining me. I want to kick off by asking you to just give us an overview in your mind of where we are in the Tory leadership race.
Oh, wow. Well, we are just a day or so short, they're too short, of the second round, which will reduce them from 5 to 4. And at this point in time, there will be all sorts of manoeuvring going on to try to get the people they think are their strongest opponents out. So that's what tends to happen. So the lending of votes from one group to another, and so on, and quite a struggle for votes. And the truth is, they're all pretty even to each other. I mean, you know, anybody who takes a bet on who goes out on Wednesday has a high appetite for risk, because it's very, very hard to predict. My hunch is that both Kemi Badenoch, and Jenrick will both still be in. The rest I couldn't guess.
Who are you backing? What horse are you backing?
I'm not. I mean, I've been talking to all of them. I did originally vote for Priti Patel before she went out, because I thought she was at risk of going out and I wanted to try and keep her in. That wouldn't necessarily have been my final vote, but it was just to sort of keep the keep them, in my view, the main players in, and I still haven't decided. Indeed, I'm speaking to one of them tomorrow, literally, for them to try and persuade me. I have issues with all of them because, let me take one example for you. A number of them are saying, right, we want to pull out of the European Court of Human Rights, right? That's an absolute no-no for me, because I don't trust governments.
You're part of government.
I know. Well, I'm now an opponent to our government at the moment, but I don't trust governments. Governments are very untrustworthy with unfettered power. And although I think the ECHR is a nightmare of an organisation, does all sorts of things it shouldn't do, it is there at the end of the day to protect the individual. That's what the original convention.
If governments are a nightmare in terms of power, is that what happened to the Tory party? Because many would say they're in a death spiral.
Oh, they're not. They're not in a death spiral. We've been here before. I've been around since Gladstone, right? So I've seen a few other supposed death spirals, and that's not the case. But there's no doubt that the last Conservative government lost its way, arguably forgot what conservatism was for, and. The leaders are not entirely blameworthy in that. They are partly blameworthy, certainly. But things like the COVID crisis sort of broke the back of the normal approach to government and landed us with, what, £500 billion of deficit, which we've now somehow got to pay off in the next... so it's like a war debt. So it sort of broke the back of things. So, yeah, they lost their way, but they're not in a death spiral. They'll be back.
Have we a bit of a weak bench in this leadership race?
Well, it's not Margaret Thatcher versus Ted Heath, let's put it that way. One of the difficulties is none of them's... because, bluntly, in modern politics, we have a bit of a cult of youth. The average age of this leadership bench, as you put it, is probably 10 years less than would have been the case in most previous circumstances. In Margaret Thatcher's government, most of the people standing for leader now would probably have been a Minister of State at best, So I don't think in innate talent, but in experience, they are a weak bench.
Yeah. Speaking from experience, when you look at what's happening right now in the world today, we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, the fact that there's a presidential election happening in the United States that has put virtually everything else on hold. What's your greatest concern?
Well, my greatest concern is the confluence of events, right? I do not remember a time like this in the number of combined challenges to government, both internationally and nationally, since 1975. I picked 1975 because that's the year the Tory party chose Margaret Thatcher as its new leader, right? And we all at the time, I was one of her supporters, we all at the time weren't sure we got it right. Right? Why? Because then we had inflation, high on inflation, unemployment, oil shocks. We had a dominant Soviet Union, a growing China, us in decline, withdrawal from empire, failures of public services at home, couldn't balance the books, foreign
cornucopia of challenges.
A cornucopia of challenges. And we got the same today. You've got the first war in Europe since the Second World War. You've got the Middle East in some of the most complex, problematic positions, whether it's Gaza or the Yemen, having huge impacts, and impacts on world trade because of the challenges there. You've got a dominant China, an unstable Russia, and at home you've got a National Health Service, which we've been unable to deliver proper outcomes from. You've got problems in all other areas of public service, an incredible problem balancing the books. And you talk about death spirals, the spiral we've got at the moment is a possible taxes go up, growth goes down. Taxes go up more, growth goes down more. That's a spiral that I fear, not a political death spiral, an economic spiral.
Yeah. If Margaret Thatcher was with us today, what do you think she'd think of her party?
She'd be telling them off and telling them to buck up, I say. Buck your ideas up, boys.
When you think about, as you say, the financial issues that are facing this government, essentially, they're a government seeking tremendous reform. How difficult do you think that is going to be for the Tories going forward? Because essentially, Keir Starmer is standing for a heck of a lot that you guys don't.
Well, he's talking a big story on reform, but I can't actually see how the talk is addressing the big subjects. Take the health service. Lots and lots of stories about reform, but what are they going to do? I mean, you know, they've already paid off a vast sum of money to the junior doctors. They appeared not to have got any productivity outcome from that at all, you know. And this is true actually across the board. Every single wage settlement they've made, and they are beginning to be quite inflationary, every single wage settlement they've made has come without any productivity deal. In truth, not a real one anyway. So I'm not sure that that they're really talking that. Also, in economic terms, they still think Gordon Brown was a good chancellor. And so what they're trying to do is copy Gordon Brown, right down to the we've just read the books. The books are always open. You know, in every Western democracy, you can read the books, whoever you are. That was a Gordon Brown trick. If you look in detail at what Rachel Reeves has done in terms of her planning, she made a thing called the Mays Lecture, which is a very big, high prestige lecture the Chancellor makes. And in her Mays Lecture, she basically said, we're going to do the off-balance sheet financing that Gordon Brown did, things like PFIs. I'm not sure whether your audience would know that, private finance initiatives, right? To give you a measure of how that worked, in Gordon Brown's day, to get 50 billion of assets, we ended up paying the private sector 275 billion. Bankers made a lot of money out of it, but we didn't get much out of it. So I don't see a big reforming government. What I see is a big talking government, and one that makes quite a few mistakes already. You know.
Yeah. Speaking of the bankers, speaking of finance, I mean, so many folks that I have spoken to have said they are considering leaving the United Kingdom. There are worries about capital flight. What is the risk, in your mind, to the economy?
Well, that's a really serious risk. I mean, you've got already, I mean, and it's partly the old government's fault. This bit is partly the old, well, actually a whole series of governments, right back to Blair and including Blair. We have got an over-regulated city now, if we talk banking and finance, you know, and as a result, already we've lost some trade. The LIBOR trade, the interbank borrowing trade has gone to New York, for example. But there's lots of others too. And loads of people are talking about leaving now. I mean, given that in some of these businesses, whether it's banking or tech, or even the not the electronic tech, but even the sort of pharmaceutical areas and things like that, you can work from anywhere in the world now.
And they've just seemingly made it much harder to do work in this country.
They made it hard to do work. We have
and somehow shameful to make money.
I don't think they're quite there. I mean, back during the Blair days, and by the way, never underestimate the extent to which not so much Blair himself, but the Blair camp has influence with this government. Huge influence. You know,
we heard him speaking just a few days ago and blaming the migration crisis on the Tories.
Yeah, as usual. But he
does have a point, does he not? The migration crisis being
well,
at least partially the fault of the former government.
The migration crisis, we tend to be rather blinkered about this. If you look around Europe, every single country in Europe, there's not one that doesn't have a migration crisis. And most of them are bigger than ours, right? Ours is rather visible because of the boats crossing the channel, the illegal migration issue. But
so you're saying we've got one, but it just ain't that big by comparison?
No. I'm saying it's big, but I'm saying no government in Europe has managed to get a grip of it. Not one. Doesn't matter whether they're left, right, centre, new, old, none of them have got a grip of it. Now, I was not a particular fan of the Rwanda policy, you know, but at the end of the day I thought, well, we haven't got anything else to deter these people. And I think one of the great mistakes Rishi Sunak made by going so early was he didn't give the Rwanda policy a chance to happen, because had, and this is an oblique answer to your question, had they actually carried out the Rwanda policy and got some flights out there, the next thing would have happened is the rest of Europe would have copied us, right, left and centre. As it is, now we've abandoned it, Germany's taken it over. But if we'd actually carried it on with it, the Germans, the French, the Austrians already, even the European Union would have been talking about third country policies. That's what it is. It's anybody who comes here who doesn't have a right to be here, they get sent to a third country they didn't want to go to, you know. And what we didn't do was finish that job. We didn't finish the delivery of the Rwanda job. So that was the primary public failure. The other one was a decision to allow basically 1 million people to come here legally. And I think that was driven by the Treasury. And it would be very interesting, because again, it goes back to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown and Blair discovered, you know, if we want to keep talking about having a terrific growth record, if we bring millions of people to the country, that pushes the growth up by itself. It's an artificial way of doing it, but nobody sees it, and it makes us look good. And I think we're going to see the same again here, actually. Otherwise, their growth numbers are going to be terrible. So let's see. I'll come back in a year and we'll talk about how this government's done with this. But I suspect it's going to prove harder than they think.
How have you seen Keir Starmer's recent travels? Because he seems to have been scurrying to every European capital, trying to make new friends and get some agreements.
Well, I don't blame him for that. Look, if you're a new government and you've come in after whatever it is, 18 years of your previous, 14 years of your previous government, you want to make the most of it. You're a new kid on the block. A lot of other countries will be willing to big you up. It's an easy photo opportunity. And there undoubtedly will have been countries sitting back and waiting, not doing deals on this, that and the other with the outgoing government, precisely because it was seen as an outgoing government. Yeah. Why would you do that? You'd wait until the new one comes in. And so he'll go and make the most of it. Frankly, I can't blame him for that. Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of things I can blame him for, but not that.
Undermining Brexit in some way.
No, not immediately. I mean, let me differentiate. I think there's a perfectly good argument for trying to warm up the relationship with some of our European colleagues. They have all got big problems of their own. Germany's economic problems and their immigration problems are off the scale. France has got It's got a divided nation, basically, in terms of its parliament. So they've all got things that they want to resolve. Now, trying to warm up relations, that's fine. That's good diplomacy. But I think in some senses Starmer may be naive if he thinks he's going to get something for nothing. Because what you can guarantee is they're going to have a shopping list. And the shopping list will be fishing rights in the North Sea, or it'll be the rights of young Europeans, by which we mean up to 30-year-olds, we're not talking adolescents here, right to come here for 4 years and so on. So you may get some backdoor things which do undermine Brexit, but so that comes out of naivety, really, on their part. I don't think it's his intention, but I think he may end up doing some of that by accident.
You mentioned Tony Blair. What's the danger in the senior doyen of the Labour Party having influence today?
Well, the part of the danger is what I've already mentioned, which is that the economic strategy of the Blair government was one that relied hugely on luck. You know, they were given a very, very good economy when they took over. They themselves said that, not publicly particularly, but privately. And then it ran out with the 2008 crash. And then everything fell to bits, and the poor financial structure of the government suddenly became apparent. If the current Labour government continues to believe that Blair and Brown were good at economics, they'll make the same mistakes: off-balance sheet accounting, poor control of costs, and poor management of growth, because they don't have such a lucky backdrop. The world at large is more problematic. America's going. Well, we don't know where America's going to go, but it's already got probably the biggest piece of protectionist legislation in modern times in the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, and you're seeing things like that all around the world. Europe is doing things like putting carbon tariffs on everybody, not just on us, on everybody. All these disruptive impacts on world trade is going to come right back into our own account, and it's going to hit our growth rates. So it's going to be harder for them. So if they just swallow, well, what happened last time, it won't work.
Yeah. Who is better for the United Kingdom, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump?
If I were an American, I'd probably vote for Harris. Almost for stability reasons, right? Not because I think one policy or the other is better.
Well, but the Biden administration hasn't really delivered on stability.
You know, I mean, I'm thinking economic stability,
Some would argue not even that.
Yeah, not even that. I know, but in comparative terms, Trump is very unpredictable. Now, there are some virtues in that. I mean, there's some virtues in having an unpredictable leader because it means people won't take chances. I mean, I always say...
I mean, do you honestly think Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine had Donald Trump been in office?
Well, that's the question, you see. And I think there is a virtue in that. You see, I mean, I think... Take one of America's most best regarded presidents of modern times, Obama, right? Obama was a calculator. You know, that's the nature of the man. He was an intellectual, sort of a lawyer, of course. But, you know, he calculated out everything. And the trouble with being a calculator is the other side can calculate too, you know. And so, you know, he makes his chess move and Putin makes his chess move, and he knows how far he can go. With someone like Trump, he's liable just to tip the chessboard up. You know, and you saw a little bit of that in his reaction to some of the Middle Eastern issues with missile attacks and so on. But you know, that's a lot to gamble on.
Yeah.
There's a lot to gamble on. So, you know, it wouldn't be an easy choice for me, but that's the way I go. You asked in terms of Britain. For us, the most important element of the relationship is NATO. You know, by a country mile, you know, whatever happens on economics will be marginal. What happens on defence will be enormous. And NATO has never been more important and never actually been weaker. You know, those two things together are terrifying. Now, it's turning around, but it's taking forever. You know,
Some would argue, though, that President Trump, while in office, actually galvanized a re-strengthening of that alliance, simply because he said, you guys have got to get off your rear end.
Funnily enough, I had this conversation with Nigel Farage, who's obviously close to Trump, and I said to him, I said, when you talk to him, tell him, you know, a lot of us agree with him, you know, kicking 7 bells out of the Germans and others for not spending enough on defence. I said, but if that's read as abandoning NATO or threatening to abandon NATO, that has the opposite impact.
Yeah.
It has, you know, it will say to Putin, actually, I don't care that much about this lot, this bunch of, you know, sort of, what's the right word? There were people free riders, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the dangerous line. And I've not heard anything for him saying, you know, NATO is massively important. Every other president since the formation of NATO, just after the Second World War, has been very clear. And, you know, it's the old thing. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah.
And what we have done is spent the peace dividend. Even the phrase, the peace dividend, it's actually like cutting back on the house insurance because you don't think it's going to burn down, you know. Terrible. So that's the worry, you know. So as you can tell by my agonised answer here, you know, it's quite a difficult call.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you know, if suddenly Trump turned around and said, actually, you know, whatever I do, I will stand up for our allies. That might be it. That might alter my view, but at the moment, you know,
wouldn't hold your breath.
It's not there.
Yeah.
You know.
Talk to me a little bit about more broadly Europe, because Obviously, the NATO conversation has started other conversations about European collective defense. You know, who is the leader of Europe? We used to talk about Germany with their economic issues and lack of leadership. We're now talking about France. Michel Barnier as the new Prime Minister of France. Good for Europe, good for UK relations?
Well, good for France, I think. Let me just deal with a slightly wider question for 30 seconds. Europe is in a bigger mess than I can remember in my adult life. Economically, it's all over the shop. I mean, people whinge on about the consequence of Brexit. We're lucky not to be in there at the moment, to be honest, because all of them are doing badly. Pretty much all of them are doing badly. And partly it's over-regulation, partly it's just
the energy question.
Energy and circumstance, you know, as well. And, of course, their dependence on Russia, you name it. So all of those things are problematic, and they don't have answers. And the second-order consequence of that is massive division. You know, you've got Germany. We designed the German constitution to prevent the rise of far right-wing parties.
And they're back.
And they're back, you know. It was literally the Brits and the French, to some extent, sat down and constructed that constitution for that reason. And it's failed. And it's partly because of all the other challenges. So it's a really, really grim, difficult backdrop. Now, Michel, dear old Michel, I actually think Michel's going to be good for France. You know, he was, at one point he wanted to run for president, decided he couldn't get the support. But nevertheless, I think he's good for France for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I think the current, the new French Prime Minister, Michel as it is, biggest job is going to be managing the division in their own parliament. It's really tough, you know. And Michel's got a sufficiently strong political base that he can reach out beyond. I mean, basically, he's a Gaullist, right?
Yes.
He can reach out. I mean, literally a Gaullist. He's an admirer of President de Gaulle, and he can reach out across the divide in a way I think Macron can't. Partly because Macron is the ultimate énarque, you know, the ultimate product of the École Nationale, like so much of, excuse me, like so much of the French establishment.
And that generation.
Yeah, political, diplomatic, civil service, and corporate, the lot. They're all énarques, right? And part of this split across Europe, and indeed the vote in the last election here, is a reaction to the sort of the elite not solving the problems that the ordinary people care about. That's why immigration is such a powerful argument. Now, that's not what Michel, that's not where he came from. I don't know if you know about his background. He started out as the mayor of Val d'Isère during the great French ski Olympics, Winter Olympics. He's one of Jean-Claude Killy's best friends, again, for your audience, probably a lot younger than me, one of the great downhill skiers of all time. You know, there are fantastic pictures of him flying, apparently completely out of control, winning the gold medals. And so he came out the local government route, you know, and he's not an école. He's not the sort of elitist.
He wasn't a corporate lawyer.
Not a corporate lawyer. He's not the elitist, and he's been in public service for a very long time. You know, I first met him when I was Europe minister back in 1994. I mean, that's how far back this goes. And he was. I mean, he wasn't a genius, but he was good. Capable.
That's your friend you're talking about.
Yeah, but you know, he is. But he's good, capable, reliable. You knew where he came from. He wouldn't always be on your side either, you know. But very often with me. But you know, a sort of man. You know, you think in a fight, I want him on my side.
Yeah, so not a genius, but good for France.
Yeah. You don't have to be. Listen, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to be a senior politician. Look around the world, you know. And the other thing to bear in mind as well, and I think people don't see this sometimes, is that in France the Prime Minister is very much second string. You know, I saw this really dramatically once, and I went to a conference in France, in Tours, I think it was, and Mitterrand was the president, and we were talking to the then Prime Minister, And Macron turns up, and it's like the king has arrived, you know. Red carpet, brass band, military, everything, you know. And the whole place was locked down as well. And then we had a press conference, and he chaired the press conference and told the Prime Minister what, you know, when he could talk, basically. So the relationship is quite a dominant one. Well, not quite, a very dominant one between the President and the Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister's got to do the practical stuff. And I think we shall be very good at that indeed.
Yeah. Walk me through the current situation surrounding Lucy Letby. For you, this is a case that smells.
Yeah, I mean, when the Letby case first happened, like most of the country, I thought, well, if she did that, she deserves to go to prison and they throw away the key, you know. And that's what I thought up until about 3.5 months ago. And I was sitting in my room waiting for a telephone call from a guy called Mike Lynch, who had just been fighting a case in California and just won it. And so I was waiting for an American telephone call, and up comes an American number, and I pick up my phone, and it's not him, it's somebody in New York, one of the previous Prime Minister's science advisors. And he said, have you seen The New Yorker? Well, I have to say, The New Yorker's not my normal reading, not sitting in London. And I said, no. And he said, well, there's a 13,000-word article about the Letby trial. I try and get hold of it. Can't get it. It's blocked online by court order. Yeah. I managed to get a copy. I read it. It's really quite persuasive. There are a lot of problems in this, right? So I raised in Parliament the next day, why can't we get a copy of this so we can actually, everybody read it? We believe in open justice, don't we? And after that, I got calls from past presidents of the Royal Statistical Society, past presidents of the Royal Paediatric and...
people were coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, but not just... I mean, you often, in my position, you often get a whole load of conspiracy theories come out. If I got up and, I don't know, talked about vaccines or something, I'd get thousands of people email me. This wasn't that. These were people who were at the top of the profession, the relevant professions, neonatologists, statisticians, medical forensic scientists, criminal forensic scientists, and people who had worked at that hospital before. So this great influx. And what it makes me worry, I mean, basically it makes me worried that the fundamental bits of the case, I haven't been able to read every single word of the case because I can't get the transcript's not available, but I've read vast amounts of reporting, literally files and files and files about it, and I'm worried, and I think they need to have a proper appeal, basically, a proper full appeal and retrial, really. I don't know that Lucy Letby's innocent, but I don't believe she's been proven guilty. That's where I'm at on this, and it's incredibly controversial and sensitive. I mean, you can imagine how the parents of the dead children feel. They're really, really upset by people even suggesting this lady might be innocent. But if she is innocent, then you've got to wonder what the other causes are. What do we know? Well, there's very, very little firm evidence. There's loads and loads of circumstantial evidence, but no firm evidence. But the one firm thing we know is the number of children who died in this hospital jumped from 2 or 3 to 15 to 17. That sort of number. There are different depending on the dates. Which was an astonishing increase. Now, was that a statistical artifact? Some professors of stats have said, yes, it probably is. Was it the murder, which is what the outcome of the trial was? Was it the failure of the whole medical system, the doctors, not enough trained nurses, not enough trained doctors, not enough resources?
Because given the state of the health system in this country, that could all be in fact true. And
in fact, there's a report saying exactly that about this hospital. That came out before the trial, but wasn't shown to the trial. One of the things I worry about, they didn't see this. There's a report from a doctor who looked at all the deaths and said there were natural causes.
Who's at fault there? Is it her lawyer's not good enough? And what was?
I can't tell. But what I do know is that from my point of view, you know, if the trial had been done with those included, I'd be less worried about it. And then finally, it might be something else. It might be an external cause like a superbug. You know, we know there's a drug called Pseudomonas in the water there. That can kill. You know, we're talking, just for your audience, these are neonates. They're sort of 30 weeks, 25 weeks gestation in some cases. You know, they're this big. They're sort of a couple of pounds. 800 grams is the sort of lowest weight that they...
Very vulnerable.
Very, very, very... And they don't really, at that period in their development, they don't really have an immune system, because otherwise you'd kill the mother, because they're normally still in gestation. So you got that. So you got that Pseudomonas, and you probably got others because they've got terrible plumbing problems. Again, old hospital, leaky plumbing, sewage backing up. Now, it just seems to me that these children may have died because of failures of the system.
Yeah.
You know, and if that's the case, then the Lucy Letby trial is not just a miscarriage, which it would be in those circumstances, but we've got real problems with the health service which are being hidden behind the trial, and that's a real problem, because it isn't just this hospital. If you look around the country in neonatal units, you see spikes everywhere. You know, from time to time. We've got a rash of serial murders, or have we got a more systematic failing in our health service?
Do you believe this government should raise an inquiry here in a very serious way? Because, as you say, it extends beyond just this woman.
No, I don't think so. Not in that sense. I think the proper answer to this is a thing in Britain called the CCRC, the Criminal Case Review Commission, right? I don't believe, even when I think something's gone wrong, I don't believe government should meddle in the law. I've seen it been done before, and it's not a nice thing to see. And governments, America, Britain, all the countries that are like us, rely on the rule of law. And the rule of law can't be the rule of law subject to the government meddling. All right, that's so no is the answer. What I think should happen is it should go back to the CCRC, and they should look at it properly and ideally decide on a new appeal, proper appeal, in which case we can test all these things. Now, there's a Thirlwell inquiry going on. There's an inquiry starting tomorrow on what we can learn from it. And what I hope the Thirlwell inquiry will do is not just say, oh, right, she's guilty, so how can we detect murderers in future? But say, this is a more general problem. Because remember, she's charged with 7 murders, but 15 or more children died. You know, so what about the other 8, you know?
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, the way it's bigger than a miscarriage, you know, because the ideal outcome of a report like this is to prevent it happening again, you know. And, you know, we're talking probably hundreds of babies' lives, you know. Really, really, really important.
You mentioned conspiracy theories. I have to ask you about the death of Mike Lynch and also, just days earlier, the death of his business partner. Foul play at work?
I don't think so. I mean, I'll wait and see what the inquiries say, right? But I don't think so. I mean, you're quite right. It is the most extraordinary odds. I mean, it's millions to one, probably many, many millions to one against two co-defendants, both of whom succeed in the same trial in a big, big corporate battle for hundreds, well, actually billions of dollars or pounds at stake. For them to die within 2 days is very, very, very long odds. If it were, I tell you what, if the opponent was a Russian corporation, I'd be taking personal measures. But no, I don't think so. But I will read the Italian. The Italians will do a good job. This is one area where the continental approach of inquisitorial justice rather than adversarial justice, you know, we're both used to adversarial justice in Britain and America. I think inquisitorial approach to what happened, who did what when, what doors were left open and so on, will be much more effective at getting the truth. And when that comes out, I'll read it carefully and review the answer to your question. But at the moment, no, I'm not assuming it's anything other than an incredibly long shot. After all, long shots happen all the time. I sometimes say to people, you know, winning the lottery is a long shot, but somebody always does, you know. So this is the case. I mean, this is very personal to me. I mean, I had lunch with Mike after he'd won the case in America. He came and he rang me up. It's the early part of the election, and he said, "Shall we have a boozy lunch?" So we went at a celebratory lunch at Wilton's in London, and we had a long, very, very good lunch, very nice lunch, and we talked about Letby. Actually, we talked about. I said, "So what are you going to do next?" And he said, well, I want to be able to answer what he calls the St. Peter question. What do you mean by that? He said, well, when I knock on the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, what have you done with your life? I want to be able to give a good answer, you know. So I'm going to first work to get this treaty with the Americans, this extradition treaty, which had led to him being tried in California, and basically incarcerated in California for a year and then tried. I'm going to get that fixed. Then I'm going to set up an innocence project. There is one in the States, I think, which is designed to help people for which there have been miscarriages of justice. He said, I think I'm going to start with this Lucy Letby trial. Now, he'd been in California and I'd been here, so he didn't know I was taking an interest. Yes. So just from his own instincts, because he was a fabulous statistician, you know, he made himself pretty much a billionaire on being the best statistical analyst in the world and being able to turn that into software. He said, I think I want to do that. And then he said, but meanwhile, I'm going to go and have a holiday. And laughingly, he said, yeah, you don't fancy a trip to the Mediterranean, you? And I said, no, I've got an election to fight. But I think to myself sometimes, what if I'd taken the invite, you know? But it wasn't really an invite, he just threw out the line. But so quite something. But no, I don't. I think there are lots of things to say about Mike Lynch's final few years, but I don't think murder enters into it. I don't think so.
There's just been a report out that HP is looking to recoup their legal fees. In your mind, is this something that should be allowed to happen? No. I mean, firstly,
I think they, not just their legal fees, they want to basically take his whole fortune.
From his widow.
From his widow. I mean, firstly, in the sort of lexicon of tastelessness, you know, while his widow's still recovering in hospital in Italy, to come out with that, I think, really says something about Hewlett-Packard. I've got very, very little time for the Hewlett-Packard management. Secondly, I think they're wrong, and I thought that they won a civil case in Britain on this, right? But I thought the judge made the wrong call. You know, I mean, I read it very, very carefully. I've studied at London Business School and Harvard Business School. I can read a balance sheet, and my view on it was the judge here got it wrong. The jury, ironically, in California on 15 counts, unanimously found in favour of Mike and against Hewlett-Packard. In effect, both him and his colleague. And I think we need to come back and appeal the British case and play out the same argument that we played in California. And I think the appeal court will find against Hewlett-Packard. And I hope they'll award spectacular costs against them, just as a lesson in manners, frankly.
In your mind, if evidence does stand up that there were major faults on the part of the captain, on the part of the crew, would you support a criminal prosecution?
Yes, I would if it's culpable, which sounds like a sidestep. Look, one of the stark outcomes here was that most of the crew, nearly all the crew survived, nearly all the passengers died. Right? Now, the first responsibility of a captain or the watch, the
is to explain where the exits are.
Is to look after the safety of everybody on board, and in particular those who probably know least, who will be the guests. Now, if what is shown is culpable negligence, then or culpable action, leaving hatches open, not making sure that people knew early enough that there was a risk, then yes, criminal charges will be appropriate, and I would expect the Italians would bring them, and that is why I think that they're quizzing everybody under sort of a criminal remit, really, at the moment. So that's the right thing to do. But it's culpable. A single accident doesn't do it. It's culpable negligence or culpable action that's the issue here. But there we are.
David, final question. What are the perks of being in the opposition? Are there any?
No.
None whatsoever?
No.
You have more time to focus on your areas of particular interest?
Look, I mean, I'm an unusual MP and I've been in opposition before. I quite enjoy opposition. I would never seek to be in opposition because, what we're trying to do is run the country, so we want to be in government. But opposition is a different set of challenges. And it's a lot of quite high-profile conflicts and arguments, and you are very much more on your own wits in opposition. So in government, you're fed your speeches, they tell you when you're going to appear in the Commons, they do all the rules checking for you. You've got basically legions of people working for you. Legions of clever people for the most part. In opposition, when I was in opposition last time, I removed 3 government ministers in short order, one after another. 2 Home Secretaries and 1 Minister of State. That took probably about as much work as I put into earning my first degree, in terms of, and my own work, all the research, all the study, all the analysis. And on the days before we actually got rid of 2 of those ministers, I and my team were up all night, working it through, when we were challenging the government over the death of Jean-Charles de Menezes, as somebody got shot after our 7/7 crisis, wrongly. They've got the wrong person, the state murdered an innocent person. We had to do the work on that. And it was vast amounts of work. But that being said, it is formidably satisfying. If you can hold a government to account, if you can make them change their behaviour and make sure that in the future they don't shoot innocent people, or change their behaviour so that, for example, the first time Tony Blair was defeated in government was by me on a thing called 90 days detention without charge. The idea the state can lock people up for 3 months without even telling them why they're locked up. And I beat him on that. That's an important piece of British history which was done from opposition. So I enjoy myself. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but most of my colleagues who don't even know that's coming.
Is there a danger in your mind that the Labour government, as is now, could knock the Britishness out of being Britain? And I ask that because, very much like in the United States, there are 2 parties, schools of thought that are fundamentally opposed at this point. And when I speak to those who have been, like yourself, in the previous governments for a long time now, there are fundamental worries about a change to British society. And we see that in the riots that we saw recently. There's a lot of conflict there. Is it a class warfare issue? In your mind, how dangerous is this government, potentially?
I don't think governments can, in the short term, alter the character of nations. They can change the institutions, which in turn do that. But I think the riots you're talking about and the reactions you're talking about, they're a little bit like the Brexit referendum. They are people reacting to a class that they feel has ignored their interests or is contemptuous of them or whatever. Now the rioters were wrong. Let's be plain about that. There's no 2 ways about it. They were breaking the law. They deserve to be punished. But that sort of reaction comes out of that sort of problem. So I don't think they'll change the character of Britain. What I have to watch, and one of my jobs really, is that they don't change the institutions. Britain, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, all have histories built on an institutional structure which nobody designed. It sort of came together, and broadly speaking, it's why we have been successful as nations. I think why most of what we do is admirable. Not everything, but most of what we do is admirable. And that's down to the institutional structure. It's not to virtuous politicians, one way or another. It's because the rule of law, the action of democracy, free speech, all are fundamental to what makes us what we are, much more than our DNA or whatever. And that's what we have to protect. And if we protect that, then the character of the nation will go where it wants to go, and it'll generally pick a good place to be. That's it.
So it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
In a journey that is rich in its content and substantiated by its details, from primitive cave drawings to the engraving of letters on stones, it set out. Writing was invented, and the alphabet shortly followed. And is the case in all journeys. What is new is the title. When you are facing a manuscript, it is inevitable that time will simply fleet you. As you enter a meditative state, as you wipe the dust off of it, the fragrance of history captivates you. You begin to visualize the very fingertips of those who created this fine craft that they excelled in. The first calligraphers excelled in their precision and artwork skills. They added diacritics, and with ink and tools they wrote it all out, and they decorated them with their motifs. These are the messages of light, passed on through the history of Arab manuscripts. Research and experimentation are a part of human nature. We did not stop developing new forms of paper after finding one plant that worked. Rather, we sought out other materials, which were skins from animals. The desired goal from this material was to be used in parallel with papyrus. The Arabs of the pre-Islamic era and the advent of Islam used these skins as a material for writing, and it would become vastly more common and widespread with time. Parchment was one of the most important writing materials, alongside papyrus, during the ancient eras. Middle Eastern civilizations used ordinary leather to write on before they were able to achieve a steady production of parchment. The oldest text that was written on leather was found in Egypt, and it dates back to the 15th century BC. For Mesopotamia, the oldest text written on hide or leather dates back to the 9th century BC. The use of leather took off from these two cultural centers to spread and reach the country of Phoenicia and the other people groups in the eastern Mediterranean region. Historical evidence indicates that man started using tanned animal hides over 30,000 years ago. Leather was mentioned in several surahs that are present in the Holy Quran, such as the surahs of Al-Hajj, An-Nisa, As-Zumar, Fussilat, and An-Nahl, where Allah stated, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful."
وَاللَّهُ جَعَلَ لَكُم مِّن بُيُوتِكُمْ سَكَنًا وَجَعَلَ لَكُم مِّن جُلُودِ الْأَنْعَامِ بُيُوتًا تَسْتَخِفُّونَهَا يَوْمَ ظَعْنِكُمْ تستخفونها يوم ظعنكم ويوم إقامتكم ومن أصوافها وأوبارها وأشعارها أثاثا ومتاعا إلى حين.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. Allah Almighty stated, in the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء ومن يضلل الله فما له من هاد.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. As for how the word leather is written in tandem with the word parchment in the Quran, the Almighty stated, in the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful.
والطور وكتاب مسطور في رق منشور والبيت المعمور والسقف المرفوع والبحر المسجور إن عذاب ربك لواقع.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. Leather that is prepared for writing is referred to as parchment, and they mostly come from the hides of the buffaloes, cows, and deer. Sheepskin was the most commonly used source of parchment, to the extent of it decorating the covers of manuscripts after they were decorated and gilded. The importance of leather was not limited to writing alone. Its various uses necessitated the existence of a specialized leather industry known as leather tanning, which is still present in current times. Leather tanning became widespread in the Arabian Peninsula, and the most famous tanners were found in Najran, Jarash, Saada, and Sana'a. To make these hides suitable for writing, they had to go through several stages of preparation. It started with the removal of the hair from its roots and removing the leftover residue by using lime water or any other preservative. The hide would be tightened on a suitable wooden frame, as this stretching process was what distinguished parchment from regular leather. After the treatment process was completed, it would be left to dry. Distinguishing the two sides of parchment is quite simple, as one side contains the hair while the other contains the flesh. Writing took place on the smoother surface. The dimensions of parchment varied according to the size of the animal that the material was taken from. There are many types of leather that were used for writing that depended on how it was sourced and the methods of how it was prepared. Known kinds of parchment were Rak, Al-Adim, and Al-Qadim. Rak, which was usually derived from deer, was one of the best and most widely used leathers for writing. It was known for being lightweight and delicate. It was made from the hide of young calves, lambs, and deer. The Arabs of the pre-Islamic era were familiar with parchment and used it to write charters, testimonies, and financial certificates. Parchment was still very prominent even after the advent of Islam, and it was one of the materials that the verses of the Holy Quran were written upon. In his book, Subh al-Asha, Al-Kalkashandi states that the companions of the Prophet unanimously agreed to write the Holy Quran on parchment due to its longevity. Thus, the use of parchments became prominent in various aspects of life that involved writing, and tanneries began to spread in many Arab cities. The most prominent of these parchments were the Kufa parchments, which were tanned with dates, This gave it softness and plasticity that surpassed other leathers. In addition to this, there were the parchments of Al-Basra, Wasit, and other Arab cities. Despite its characteristics of how easy it was to preserve and its longevity, the fact that it could be washed and have what was written on it be erased constituted a set of flaws that could not be overlooked. Especially with the increase of papyrus production, which competed with parchment with how lightweight it was, how easy it was to carry, and how difficult it was to forge. There were advantageous differences between papyrus and parchment, placing the latter in the second place as a writing material after papyrus proved to be superior. Our libraries are stocked with manuscripts written on leather. This is the clearest evidence of that papyrus did not eliminate the existence of parchment that was made of leather. During those times, both progress and a need for improvement drove humans to discover paper. This elevated creating manuscripts to another level, facilitated its journey across time, and allowed it to shine through with anticipation of learning about what they had contained.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, hundreds killed and wounded as Lebanon sees its deadliest day since the end of the civil war. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is broadening its strikes against Hezbollah. And the Red Cross saying it is mobilizing teams in Lebanon as thousands of people flee the south of the country. Well, hundreds of people have been killed and wounded in Israeli attacks across Lebanon in what officials are calling the deadliest day since the end of the civil war in that country. Lebanon's health ministry saying children, women and paramedics have been amongst those killed and wounded. Lebanon's education minister announcing schools will be closed for 2 days in areas hit by Israeli strikes. Israeli forces have initiated a series of intense and targeted air raids across eastern and southern Lebanon in recent days, significantly escalating the already volatile conflict with Hezbollah. In the wake of these recent attacks, at least one civilian has lost their life, while 17 others have sustained injuries, highlighting the grave humanitarian impact of this escalating violence. In response to the intensifying hostilities, local residents in affected areas have received urgent orders to evacuate immediately from locations associated with Hezbollah, as uncertainty and fears for their safety loom large over their communities. This mass exodus underscoring growing concern for civilian well-being amid escalating military activity. And as tensions do continue to rise, Hezbollah declaring what they term a battle of reckoning with Israel, a bold proclamation that further intensifies the stakes in this already precarious region. The situation remains fluid, with the potential for a broader conflict casting a long shadow over both nations and the wider Middle East. Well, let's get an update from Tel Aviv now with our correspondent there, Sarah Coates. Sarah, thanks for joining us. Look, talk to us about what's happening in Israel right now. What's the atmosphere like? What are people braced for in the coming days?
Hello there, Rosanna. Certainly a lot of anxiety, worry here on the ground. There have been strikes throughout the course of the day, rockets fired from Lebanon into Israeli territory, targeting a number of areas. We're speaking specifically here about army bases, also the Rafael weapons production facility in Haifa, with rockets also falling in parts of the West Bank. Now, we have heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's come out to say that there are complicated days ahead, urging Israeli residents to follow guidelines from the Home Front Command. Now, as we go to where these guidelines have not changed, for people here in central parts of the country, they are being warned just to remain vigilant, basically, to know where their shelters are. But this, of course, is a very different situation to those people in these very largely evacuated northern communities. We do need to remember that some people have remained up there, despite really most people being evacuated when this war did begin. Schools have been closed for the next few days, while people really are staying inside shelters as we go to where. Now, this, of course, is an extremely worrying development. Still no idea as to what lies ahead for the coming days, but certainly people on the ground are preparing for what could be the worst.
And, you know, hard to summarise exactly what everyone is saying there in Israel, but of course not much say in the strategy of the Israeli government to begin this aerial bombardment campaign in Lebanon today, which has left hundreds dead. If you've got a sense, though, of how it's being received, the Israeli government strategy to begin opening what's called a second front in the north.
Well, these people in the north, they've been furious, really, with the Netanyahu government for many, many months now. They've been demanding a change to the status quo. They have been demanding that they be allowed to return back home. And they say what needs to happen for this to happen is a change in the security situation. So, of course, these people who have been wanting to go home, I'm sure they will be happy that something is being done about it. But as you did mention, severe casualties in Lebanon, 274 people dead. That is the latest number coming from Lebanon's health ministry. 1,000 other people, others wounded, which are extremely worrying numbers. And we did hear from Lebanon's health minister saying that these are expected to rise. But once again, the Israeli government has really been coming under a lot of pressure over these last few months to return these northern civilians, some 60,000 people, to their homes. So certainly what we've been hearing from Israeli officials is that this is now a new war goal and they will do everything to achieve it. Now, Israel's been vowing really to intensify these attacks until Hezbollah understands, but still absolutely no word as to how long we can expect this to go on for.
Yeah, the pressures on the Netanyahu government you've listed there. Now they're saying this war goal to bring the 60,000 displaced Israelis home in the north, of course, still haven't returned all the hostages from Gaza, as was one of their original stated aims post-October 7th. And that conflict's still happening. So how much discussion is there in Israel of what is also happening concurrently in Gaza whilst the world's attention is on Lebanon?
Yeah, we do know that there have been strikes throughout the course of the day in Gaza, and we've seen these protests happening really over the last 6 months, really intensifying here in Israel. People are furious with Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that he lacks strategy. He's not adhering to any of these war goals, and one of those is also bringing home these remaining hostages. Now, he did come out over the last couple of days saying that he intends to free some 30 hostages that do remain alive in the first phase of a deal. But of course, we do know right now that a deal does remain elusive. So he's very much being criticised in many parts of the country and by many people for what they see as a lack of strategy, a lack of goals, and just really a lack of war strategy going forward. Basically, people are accusing Benjamin Netanyahu of trying to appease a number of people, specifically the far right-wing elements of his government, like the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and also the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who we do need to remember Benjamin Netanyahu relies on to remain in power. So once again, he is or has been copping a lot of flack over his handling of this war. So I'm sure we will hear more reaction to what's going on today in the coming hours.
Sarah Coates speaking to us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you. Well, for more, I'm now joined by the Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and former Special Envoy to Iran, Elliot Abrams. Thanks for making time. Look, when Israel's Defense Minister announced a new phase of the war after the explosions last week amongst electronics devices, do you think this is what we're seeing right now? How did you interpret those words?
Yes, I think the pagers, the walkie-talkies, and the Israeli bombings of more Hezbollah sites near the border, above the border, and the killing of some of the leaders of the Radwan force all are precisely what he was talking about.
In terms of Israel saying today that every house they strike contains weapons in Lebanon, how likely do you think that is?
Well, I have no intelligence information about that, but Hamas and Hezbollah both hide weapons, including missile launchers, in the houses of civilians, which makes those legitimate military targets. It's a tragic thing, but the blame goes to Hezbollah because placing military equipment in a private home like that is against the laws of war.
In terms of that, then we end up in, again, trying not to draw parallels between the situations because they're very different, Gaza and Hamas and Lebanon and Hezbollah. But Israel saying it has a need to target, civilian areas in order to get commanders like they did on Friday. But of course, then necessarily there are bystanders, there are civilians who are damaged or killed or wounded as a result of those actions as well. So is it defensible what Israel is doing within the goals of trying to, A, sort of return these displaced residents in the north of Israel home, but B, make Israelis feel safer?
In my view, it's completely defensible. Remember what's going on here. The war between Israel and Hamas started on October 7th of last year. It did not involve Hezbollah. Hezbollah decided, we want in. We're going to continue to attack Israel until there is some kind of deal that ends the fighting in Gaza. Hezbollah had no reason to do that. It could have stayed out, but it chose to involve Lebanon in that war. That's the problem. Now, as long as Hezbollah is lobbing missiles into Israel, they have an absolute right to attack the forces that are doing that.
And Hezbollah has Iranian backing, as, allegedly Hamas does too. And let's talk then about Iran, the big spectre behind it all, because over the weekend, words from, and this is from Iranian state media, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi saying that Iran is an ally of Hezbollah, but is not planning a direct act of revenge. This was for the killing of Ibrahim Akil in a targeted airstrike on Friday in Lebanon, saying, quote, this is from Iran, the incident is a matter for Hezbollah and it will certainly show an appropriate reaction in due course. So really putting the responsibility on Hezbollah there and sort of distancing themselves somewhat. I mean, how did you interpret that?
Yes, I think that the Iranians do not want a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah remains their deterrent against an Israeli attack on their nuclear weapons program. And I think that they don't want that eliminated. So I think they're trying to stay out of this. And I think it's also a message to Hezbollah, don't escalate this because we don't want a full war.
It is. It does seem to read like that. And I'm interested in you saying that, given that you were previously a US Special Envoy for Iran. You have so much knowledge of how that country behaves. And you were tasked with helping achieve a maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Do you feel, given the events that we're currently seeing at the moment with Iranian allied groups, pro-Iranian militias, including people like the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, who've also been sort of firing missiles recently, do you feel like enough pressure has been exerted over the years?
No, I don't. I think Iran has a great formula here that works for them, which is they stay back and there are proxies all over the place. The Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, Hamas, attack not only Israel, but in the Gulf, attack neutral shipping, attack American ships, and nobody puts any pressure on Iran. So that works for the Iranians until someone, and it's got to be really the United States, says that game is over. And I think we've not said that. I mean, people talk about Houthi ballistic missiles aimed at or hitting ships. There are no Houthi ballistic missiles. They don't build ballistic missiles. Those are Iranian missiles. So I think Iran has not paid a price for any of this, and that's the problem.
Is that anything to do with, and we will come back to the situation in the Middle East, but let's stay with the US for a second, where you're speaking to us from, obviously. Is it anything to do with the way that the Biden administration has handled Iran over the recent years?
Well, I think it does. I mean, just to take one example, when the Trump administration left office, the reachable, usable foreign currency reserves of Iran were down to about $4 billion. Since then, they've made over $100 billion selling oil, mostly to China. And since then, the Biden administration has unfrozen $16 billion in funds that Iran has now got access to. That's not maximum pressure. And we know that some of that money is spent on the IRGC, on the Houthis, on Shia militias, on Hezbollah, which gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year as a subvention from Iran. So I think there has just not been enough foreign, but particularly American, pressure on Iran. As I said, it just pays no price for all of these activities.
So if you were to advise either Harris or Trump in a hypothetical who will be entering the White House in 6 weeks from now, that would be your first port of call with regard to Iran, would be hit him in the sanctions, hit him in the oil price, hit him in the economy?
Well, that would be one of two things. The other is I would make it very clear to Iran that if a Houthi, so-called Houthi missile, which is really an Iranian missile, hits an American ship, our reaction will be against Iran. We're not interested in hitting their proxies if that happens. We did this in the Trump administration, and the level of proxy attacks on the United States in Iraq and Syria went way, way down at the end of the Trump administration. You have to tell the Iranians they will pay the price.
Is there a sense that the proxies, and let's refocus back on Hezbollah, will feel isolated, left out in the cold by a statement from Iran saying basically it's up to you how you fight back, how you react, especially given that their command structure, their communication structure has been attacked so aggressively by Israel over the past week in the name of self-defense? Is there a sense that they'll feel isolated from Iran? Will there be a sense of anger?
I think they'll be, I wouldn't say isolated, but I'd say it is a clear distancing. I think that was the word you used. I think that's quite right. And it is a clear message from Iran. Don't turn this into a full-scale war. We don't want that to happen. So I think they will be at least disappointed.
Are we in a full-scale war currently?
No, we're not. I mean, one measure of that is there are no Israeli troops crossing the border. There are no Hezbollah troops trying to cross the border into Israel. We are certainly at a moment of increasing hostility and attacks, but personally, I still don't think this is going to turn into a full-scale war.
In terms of the, some have called it a decoupling that Israel is trying to achieve regarding the way the rest of the world is perceiving what it's doing on the one hand, on the one front in Gaza with Hamas, and in the other sense, on the second front in Lebanon in Hezbollah. And that's also related to Netanyahu's domestic political aims at home. How much do you buy that? Do you think there is a decoupling strategy going on? Do they want people to perceive one being different than the other or combined?
I think they can't fully be decoupled because it is the strategy of Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, to couple them. I mean, what he has said publicly is, we will continue this until there is some kind of ceasefire in Gaza. So as long as that's Hezbollah policy, they can't be decoupled. I think what's changed is the Israelis have been, in a sense, taking this and saying, well, there's nothing we can do because we have a war in Gaza. The war in Gaza, from the Israeli point of view, is largely over, militarily, that is. There are fewer Israeli troops each month in Gaza. And so now they've turned to the north, and I think they're changing their strategy and saying to Hezbollah, this has got to stop. This stops now.
In terms of the war in Gaza, you say being more or less militarily in the decline, or sort of they're pulling those troops away, so there's a sense that there is less activity there. However, the stated war aims of Netanyahu post-October 7th to return all the hostages, to basically root out Hamas completely and anybody responsible for October 7th, those goals were not achieved. They have not been achieved so far.
Right.
In terms of what he is therefore trying to achieve with northern Israel, returning some 60,000 displaced northern Israelis home, and this is what he's saying is justifying the current actions over Lebanon. Do you think he could achieve those war aims and in a tighter time frame?
Well, we would all like to see those aims achieved by some kind of ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, leading Hezbollah perhaps to say, okay, we're stopping too. That would be great. But I don't see any evidence yet that Hamas wants such a deal. U.S. government officials, Brett McGurk and others, have said publicly that Secretary Blinken has said that Hamas seems to be backing away from a deal. I think that's the problem at this point. It may be logical from Sinwar's point of view. He doesn't want to give up the hostages. But until that happens, I think there's no ceasefire deal possible.
Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdel-Bati saying yesterday that all the components of a ceasefire deal are ready. In his words, the problem is the lack of political will on the Israeli side. Is there a sense that there is no appetite for a deal from Israel then?
No, I don't believe that. I mean, that is his view, or at least that's his public statement. But that's not what we're hearing publicly or privately from U.S. officials. What we're hearing from U.S. officials is that Israel's ready to do a deal and Hamas is backing away.
In terms of the way US officials are talking about what's happening in large scale, the escalation, but more specifically in Lebanon right now today, the Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby suggesting escalation not in Israel's best interest. Do you think that US messaging is coherent and right?
I think it's coherent. I think the President, Secretary of State, Kirby, others are saying we don't want to see escalation and it's not in Israel's interest. I don't think it's right, however. I think the lesson the Israelis learned from Gaza was don't look at your enemy and think you know what that enemy is thinking and planning. Look at capability. And when they look at the capability of Hezbollah, I mean, that's why 60, 70, 80,000 Israelis moved away from the border because of those capabilities. And the Radwan forces were right on the border. So the Israelis are saying, okay, that kind of Israeli policy failed. And we have to deal now with Hezbollah's military capability. And they've been sending very clear messages in the last few weeks to Hezbollah saying, back up, back off. And, we just don't know yet whether they're being received in Lebanon. It looks as if they're actually being received in Tehran. And if they're being received in Tehran, then perhaps Nasrallah will look for a way out.
And I think that's an interesting point you raise in terms of who else can communicate with Hezbollah, because as we've already discussed as part of this, their relationship with Iran is interesting on and of itself. But what about with the Lebanese people? It's often said that the militia group that is Hezbollah outweighs the strength, of course, of the Lebanese defense forces, their own military, and that, of course, creates a big imbalance issue in Lebanon. Is there anything that ordinary Lebanese can do, the political class, in terms of dealing with Hezbollah in the country at the moment?
No, I wish I could say yes, but I think the answer is no. The Lebanese army is not going to take on Hezbollah. And I think there's very good evidence to suggest that Lebanese are very unhappy with what Hezbollah is doing and the threats and the damage that Lebanon is suffering. And as you know, for about 5 years, there's been a collapse of the Lebanese economy, a 98% reduction in the value of the Lebanese pound. But there really isn't anything Lebanese can do about this. Just another example, for 2 years, there's no president of Lebanon. And that's really because Hezbollah has been unwilling to make a deal with others in the Lebanese political system. So it's a tragic situation.
What's needed then in terms of international support for Lebanon? Do you want to see, obviously, some are accusing the UN Security Council at the moment of being somewhat toothless or unable to act much. But what about outside of security? What about funding a diplomatic government support for Lebanon?
We all want to see, I think, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 enforced, which would have Hezbollah moving away from the border and the Lebanese army moving down to the border areas. But money alone won't do that. I mean, money is useful for keeping the Lebanese economy afloat, but it won't solve the security issues.
In terms of other ways that the US could support this situation now and help de-escalate things just widely within the Middle East, in terms of, we've talked about messaging to Israel, that's been clear from Kirby, but in terms of messaging to Iran, is there anything that can be done?
I think there is. I think we're seeing, certainly from the US point of view, we're seeing attacks on Americans and on American ships. We're also seeing a closure, about a 2/3, 3/4 closure of the Suez Canal traffic and dangers in the Bab el-Mandab, the Red Sea. I think the United States could make it clearer to Iran, we will hold Iran responsible for that. Particularly the U.S. I mean, it's a fact that both CENTCOM and the U.S. Navy are asking the White House for permission to do more, to push back more against Iranian proxies. They haven't been given that permission yet, but I think if they did push back more, that would be another message to Tehran to pull back, as apparently Tehran is now willing to say to Hezbollah.
I almost don't want to take attention away from what's happening in the Middle East and put it back on the US, but given what you're saying there, and given that you held significant positions for Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and previously Donald Trump, if we were to see Donald Trump back in the White House in 2 months from now, do you think you would see those kind of messages getting through to the White House? How would he handle the military and defense strategy and foreign policy strategy regards Iran?
Well, Trump is always unpredictable, but if you go by the record of his 4 years in office, he would take a harder line. I mean, his policy was maximum pressure. And in 2020, we actually threatened the Iranians and told them that if an Iranian proxy killed an American, our response would hit Iran, not that proxy. So I see no reason to believe that has changed. And I therefore think that he'd have a harder line against Iran. He'd have a tougher, more ambitious line against Iran.
And all that being said, Iran will, of course, always have other allies it looks towards, namely, looking north up to Russia, elsewhere in the world. Do you think it feels well supported by its allies at the moment?
I think it does. And this has been a change in the last few years that's really terribly negative. I mean, if you go back to the Obama administration before the JCPOA, the Bush administration, even before then, Every UN Security Council resolution against Iran, for example, saying Iran could not enrich uranium, was unanimous and included Russia and China. Now, of course, they're protecting Iran in the Security Council. They're trying to protect Iran in the IAEA Board of Governors, and we know that now there's arms trade between Russia and Iran, and we know that they have shipped apparently hundreds of ballistic missiles to Russia. That's a new and different development in the last 3 or 4 years, and of course a very harmful one, dangerous one.
Harmful and dangerous, and is there any way of stopping such an action from taking place?
Yeah, there is one that I'd like to see. I would like to see Britain, France, and Germany, who are part of the JCPOA, invoke what's called snapback, which they have the right under the JCPOA deal to do. And that would snap back all the UN sanctions. Traditionally, China in particular has abided by UN sanctions. I think that's worth a try.
Certainly, it seems anything would be worth a try at the moment in terms of de-escalating tensions as they are stemming from Iran at the moment. In terms of the way that other regional powers are dealing with this, and I'm talking Middle East regional powers now, you know, Qatar, Egypt, UAE, other countries often highlighted for their role in trying to mediate the situation that's happening in Gaza. Has anything stood out to you about the way that this has been handled compared to the past with sort of Middle East collaboration?
Pardon me, one thing is different, and that's the enlarged role for Egypt. Sometimes in the past, this has been a Qatari activity, this kind of mediation with Hamas. But for obvious geographical reasons, the Egyptians are taking a much larger role now. They're in all the meetings, and they count because, of course, they have a border with Gaza. So that is a change. We're also seeing the Gulf countries in the last, say, couple of years try to keep a certain peace between them, a certain accord between them and Iran. In the case of the Saudis, in the case of the UAE, of course, this is a long story with Qatar, but we have seen the Saudis and the Emirates negotiate with Iran, and in essence, I think, send a message to Iran, whatever you're doing with Israel, it's not us.
Elliot Abrams, Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Well, let's get a different perspective on events happening in Lebanon now. I'm joined by a clinical psychologist and president of mental health charity Embrace, based in Beirut, Mia Atawi. Thank you very much for making time for us. And let's just start by asking, what's it like being in Lebanon today?
It's been a very difficult day. A lot of panic in the streets, a lot of anxiety. A lot of people fleeing the south regions, and this has escalated very quickly in the last 24 hours. And right now, it just took me an additional 2 hours to reach my home, which is 20 minutes away from the capital, because of the traffic of people migrating and moving from the south towards the north and safer regions. It really looks like a war zone here in the country, other than, of course, the affected areas right now in the south.
Now, the Lebanese people are celebrated, sometimes supported, held up by the international community as being so resilient because of everything your country has dealt with over the past few years and decades. In terms of what we're seeing now, though, a very deadly day for Lebanon, the escalation of the last week or so, how do people cope? How do you advise people cope in Lebanon mentally?
Honestly, I think that's a very false impression that people are resilient. People are not doing well. People have not been coping well in the past few years. And we have been going through actually an ongoing and continuous traumatic stress disorder here in the country as a result of these accumulative conflicts that we have been exposed to in the last 11 months have added to these stressors on the Lebanese people. So yes, we might seem on the surface that we are functioning or going about our daily lives and trying to fulfill our responsibilities towards our families, our jobs, and our country. But in fact, the demand for mental health services has never been higher in the past few months. Running a mental health charity that provides free community mental health services. We have, even before the recent escalation of the events, we have had a waiting list for more than 4 to 5 months in terms of requests for therapy. So no, I don't believe that we are resilient or doing well, but in fact, these events are really impacting to a significant level, not only our mental health, but our physical health as well, I might say.
And you run a helpline as well. Talk to us what that's like at the moment.
It's been a very difficult day. The line has been off the hook since the early hours of the morning. Embrace operates the National Emotional Support and Suicide Prevention hotline in the country in collaboration with the Ministry of Health. It has been a difficult time to get even our volunteers who operate this lifeline on a 24/7 to be able to commute. Many of them in the last few days have been suffering because they have had to evacuate their homes in the suburbs of Beirut or evacuating their homes in the south, and have had difficulty even themselves reaching our call center to be able to serve their duties toward our community. So it has been difficult managing both our volunteer base, our community base, but also responding to the increased number of calls that we have been receiving from individuals who are panicked, who are stressed, who are we are now beginning to witness calls to the lifeline from individuals who are requesting contact information for shelter, for food, for emergency services. And we saw this happening a few years back when the devastating events of the Beirut port happened. We saw these events happening also in 2019 when there was the surge of the economic crisis, in 2020 during COVID. So it's like a non-ending cycle for the Lebanese when we run a suicide hotline, but at the same time now we are getting calls for emergency information and where people can go to be safe, not just mentally but also physically right now. And this is a big threat, of course.
In terms of you talking to us and talking about what it's like to be Lebanese and for the people that you help in the country right now, is there a psychological part to that it does something to share, to tell people about what's happening, to tell people about what you're going through, rather than, for example, keeping up the appearance of a resilient state, which you said obviously you don't agree with?
No, I don't agree with that. But if you go down to the field, if you are today between the people, you will hear that people are not able to sleep, are not able to function, are not able to go about their daily functioning, are not able to plan for the future. And these are major concerns because they impair us not only on the short term, but on the long term as well. So what people are suffering from today is, again, I say this, an ongoing traumatic stress disorder. And I have to say that this term, as mental health professionals, we have not considered talking about, and it first came up even in the apartheid era in South Africa back in the 1980s. Today, we are going back to this level of discussing these kinds of mental health problems and illnesses in 2024 as a result of what our population and also the Palestinian population are going through in the region. And these have serious implications on people's well-being over the next few years.
And when you talk about the implications on well-being over the next few years, it's mentally, obviously, but is it what other effects does it have? Physical? Is there effects on relationships, families?
Of course. We are already witnessing these effects on our community, on our society. In the past few years, we have witnessed a mass exodus of the Lebanese population to other countries, and we have continued to see this since the end of the summer this year and since the beginning of the war, actually. So this is a huge impact on our Lebanese society, who is losing most of its people, most of its youth, who will be able to bring back the country on its feet in a few years. These people now are in other countries. But yes, there is also an impact on our physical health. We know that continuous traumatic stress impacts the nervous system. It decreases our immunity. And we have also witnessed in the past few years in Lebanon an increase in certain diseases, certain cancers, certain illnesses that were not as prevalent in the Lebanese community and are hitting people who were previously healthy and young. And we are beginning to wonder why these physical illnesses are also impacting our healthy and young community. And this must have a tie to the mental stress that they have been going through.
What are the main trigger points? And I'm almost sorry to talk about it, but it is interesting to know, as that you can be aware of it, that trigger sort of these types of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders, and in-crisis disorders that you're talking about, beyond, of course, literal aerial bombardment and strikes and bombings. But are we talking about things like graphic videos and imagery, things that are shared on social media as well, or is it just the general sense of the unknown of what's coming next?
No, it's a combination of both, of course. People have been stuck to their screens for a very long time, and of course in the last 48 hours even worse, but it has been ongoing for the past 11 months, where we have been living in uncertainty, waiting. Every day, every week, we have an event that will tell us, that will make us ask the question, what will happen next? Will it be tomorrow? Will it be in the next few hours? Will it be in the next few weeks? And again, I emphasize that this has impaired our ability to make any plans for the future, whether academic plans, work plans, economic plans, any kind of plans that will help us have a sense of normal functioning in our everyday life. So it is the news, it is what we are seeing, it is the threats, but also it is the actual events that are taking place, especially in the last week in Beirut, where we experienced these horrific pager attacks that happened in the middle of the city among civilians, that impacted children, women, people in their daily living, people in their supermarket, people in the streets. These events, of course, added an additional layer of uncertainty, of randomness, and indeed the appraisal today that anything can happen that will make me lose my life or make me lose my family is an accurate appraisal of the events. It's no longer something that is illusionary or that there's a potential that this can happen.
In terms of consuming information, then, if you are Lebanese and this is happening in your country, how do you go about advising people who have come to you for that type of advice? Do you say to them, watch the news, listen to the news, don't listen to the news, listen to your family, don't look at social media? Because obviously people have an appetite to know what's going on. There's misinformation out there as well, of course. So what do you say to people?
Well, we say to people to try to cope in the best way that they can. It is very difficult to tell people to stay away from the news, but every individual needs to monitor their own ability to make balance between what they can take in and to take also breaks from the news to be able to attend to their other responsibilities and to really reflect on a daily basis about their boundaries and their ability to take in the horrific news that's coming in on a daily basis. So yes, some breaks away from social media, from the news is very important during this period.
Thank you for answering our questions. I just want to finish by asking you, Mia, and thank you for your time you've given us today. Clearly, you're dealing with everything you're helping other people with dealing with as well. So in terms of looking after your own health so you can help others, what do you try to do? Is it sleep? Is it health? I mean, how do you cope so you can help?
It's a difficult question. It's important to say that I don't always cope in the best ways. Over the weekend, for example, like many people, we were in a freeze reaction. This freeze reaction really puts us, in almost a shutdown mode where we can't react. But at the same time, we have a huge responsibility towards our community. So I try to focus on giving attention to the people who need it the most, my team, my family, but also understand my limits. So when I needed to shut down over the weekend, I did, and I stayed away from the news for a few hours. And then we have to get back on our feet and work on the front lines, because this is what we've been doing for the past few years. And unfortunately, it's tiring, it's burdening, but we are living in a country where we have to be on our feet, unfortunately, all the time.
Clinical psychologist and president of mental health charity Embrace, Mia Attawi, thank you. Well, I'm now joined in the studio by military expert and advisor to the Al Arabiya Network, Riyad Khawaji. Thank you very much for making time. Let's talk Israel's strategy. In the last few hours, Benjamin Netanyahu saying that he does believe Israel is beginning to shift what he's calling the balance of power in the north of Israel regards the attacks, the airstrikes currently being carried out on Lebanon, the explosions potentially last week. They didn't claim responsibilities for those, but the goal is to bring displaced Israelis back home. What do you make of his comments there? Do you think balance of power really is being shifted?
I think what we're seeing right now is Israel using its overwhelming force to create a situation where we have total chaos. The bombardment is now targeting all of South Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. It's not just the south. So we're seeing now waves, long queues of cars leaving South Lebanon, people leaving Bekaa Valley. These are the areas that are inhabited predominantly by Hezbollah's supporters, predominantly Shiite communities in these two neighborhoods. So he is creating a strong pressure on Hezbollah to agree to the Israeli terms. First, Israel wants Hezbollah to separate Lebanon, South Lebanon, from Gaza, that Hezbollah would be willing to talk about a ceasefire in Lebanon independent of what happens in Gaza. So, as we know, Hezbollah opened the front in South Lebanon on October 8 as support to Gaza. Netanyahu wants to change this equation. So now he's carrying out this massive offensive. So far it is by air. We have hundreds of sorties carried out by the Israeli Air Force today. And with the threat of going into the land invasion as a second phase, to create or to achieve the objective of pushing Hezbollah to the northern Litani area in South Lebanon. So right now, I think Netanyahu, the Israeli government, is hoping that this bombardment, this air campaign, might be sufficient to convince Hezbollah to go and seek diplomatic solution, separate the Lebanon from Gaza. Otherwise, they're preparing the ground for phase 2, which is most likely is a ground offensive.
How extraordinary would a ground offensive be from Israel into Lebanon? We haven't seen ground troops of that nature entering Lebanon for a long time. What would it look like?
We haven't seen that. I mean, Israel pulled out of Lebanon in 2000. And in 2006, we saw a limited incursion, during this a brief summer war in 2006. This one would be significant if Israel decides to capture and hold territory. We don't know yet how big. Is it going to be just 10 kilometers? Are they going to go all the way to the Litani River, which means like more than 20 kilometers deep into Lebanon? This is significant because, first of all, there's going to be boots on the ground, which means very likely there will be maybe massive number of casualties on Israeli side, among Israeli troops, because Hezbollah is known to have prepared itself for ground battles. So, and Hezbollah is known to have some sort of good experience in this area. So Israel would be risking having a big number of casualties amongst its troops on the ground. The balance of power in Israel's favor. So Israel will definitely eventually be able to capture territory, but at what cost? Whether Israel would be willing to pay that cost, and if Israel captures this land, would Israel be interested in giving it up as part of a UN resolution, of a political diplomatic agreement, or are we talking about creating a whole new facts on the ground, and Israel is deciding to hold territory as a permanent security zone on the northern borders? So there's a lot of question marks over here on how things will unfold. I think right now the Israeli government has put a strategy in place, and I think we'll play it by ear. They will see how much Hezbollah would be receptive to this strategy, and how strong will Hezbollah show a sort of resilience, resistance, and I think they will build on this.
Interesting. So whilst you're clear there that Israel would be the sort of the stronger pair of hands at the moment, if it did decide to do that, they would still feel a very strong response from Hezbollah. How strong are Hezbollah at the moment, though? Were they not weakened considerably by the attacks across the pagers and walkie-talkies last week?
Definitely Hezbollah received some strong hits over the past week. It is command and control infrastructure was undermined, its communication system jeopardized. The elite force, the Al-Radwan, this is the elite force that spearheads any offensive or defensive operations for Hezbollah. The command has been wiped out completely. This is like unprecedented. The impact definitely is severe on Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is feeling it now during this war. Also, Israel has demonstrated a strong awareness, intelligence awareness of Hezbollah's capabilities, the location of its forces, its command, and so forth, and has managed to hit a lot of arms depots, launchers. This will impact Hezbollah's firepower, ability to inflict a strong firepower in depth inside Israel. This will be affected. This will help Israel. And as we know, Israel does have a very advanced air defense system, between the Iron Dome, the David Sling, and so forth. They have been able to withstand a lot of the attacks by Hezbollah. I think the risk of Israel losing big numbers of casualties will be in a land incursion. If they go into South Lebanon, there where many experts expect and predict that Israel will eventually suffer casualties, losses in its hardware and so forth, but not as much as a result of the Hezbollah bombardment, which has been reduced its capability because of the Israeli bombardments and because of Israel obtaining and using efficiently its air defense system.
Is that similar then to what we've seen Israel doing in Gaza over the last year? I'm not trying to draw parallels. I know there's separate situations between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Gaza and Hamas. However, we saw Israel conducting large-scale aerial bombardments, saying they were striking quote-unquote terrorist targets, and then we saw ground invasion. Is that similar to what they're doing here? So they start with the aerial bombardment?
Of course. I mean, aerial bombardment is always the opening scene in any a massive operation. The all-out war that we've been talking about or worrying of has actually started. The only thing missing from it is the land incursion part. That has not started yet. But what we saw today is definitely the start of an all-out war, and it's a prelude for a land invasion, unless Hezbollah moves quickly and agrees to separate the situation in Lebanon from Gaza and decides to go and seek a diplomatic solution, the one that was proposed by the U.S. presidential envoy Amos Hochstein. If Hezbollah decides to embrace this, adopt this, then this could save the day and avert and prevent a land incursion, which could lead to a lot of complications further in the future.
Over the last 24 hours or so, or over the weekend, we heard from Iranian state media that Iran was saying, well, Hezbollah will probably contain this situation. They will control it, but it's ultimately up to them. Iran-backed Hezbollah, that is. So do you think when it comes to Hezbollah engaging in negotiations, as you're talking there, and accepting some sort of diplomatic agreement, they would be acting independent of Iran, or would this be with Iran sort of around the table or behind the table?
Iran today is facing a terrible dilemma. They have lost. They had, before October 7, 2023, Iran had Israel sandwiched between two fronts from the south and the north. They had Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. After what happened since October 7, Hamas has been degraded considerably. And therefore, we can say Iran lost the southern front. Now it's facing the possibility of losing the northern front if Israel managed to degrade Hezbollah's capability considerably. And by this, Iran would lose two bargaining cards that has helped in negotiations with the US, with Europe, with so many players. So this is a big risk Iran is taking now. And also Hezbollah and Hezbollah's popular base in Lebanon is raising big question marks. You can see this over social media. Where is Iran? I mean, Iran, which has been threatening and promising retaliation and intervention and wiping Israel out, today is talking about negotiation opportunities, talking about the Americans as being friends, and talking about opportunities to reach a nuclear deal, so as if they were being used by the Iranians to achieve political ends. So the situation right now is very volatile for the Iranians, and they are risking losing what they have built over the past few decades in northern Lebanon, on Israel's northern borders, and southern Israel. And this is going to impact their bargaining power vis-a-vis the West and regional countries.
Really interesting. Let's now think about Israel's perception, the rest of the world, and how it's perceiving, supporting or not Israel in what it is currently doing. Obviously, the US has come out in the last 48 hours and said they hope for anything but military escalation, but they're the biggest aid donor, sort of funder of Israel. Clearly, that's not curbing Israel in terms of what it's trying to do. What about more allegations of war crimes? For example, the scope of the aerial bombardments. Israel according these very sort of precision targeted strikes on terrorist infrastructure. Other people are saying these are civilian areas. Could this be something that would increase pressure on Israel?
Well, in a way, yes, but also the Israelis are going to be using a lot of the videos on social media that's showing arms depots in between buildings and residential areas blowing up. So they're going to be claiming that, a lot of our strikes were against arms depots, arms launchers, missile launchers in between the buildings. And here are the proofs, There are on social media quite a good number of videos showing this. So the Israelis will be using this as a line of defense, to justify their massive strikes. Right now, we don't have people on the ground so far independently verifying, every strike, whether it actually hit that many people. But right now, we have the health authorities in Lebanon talking about a few hundred already casualties between killed and injured as the result of this massive air campaign today. So, and same thing, same scenario you're going to hear. We heard in Gaza, we're going to see again, repeated in Lebanon. He said, I said, Israelis said, Hezbollah said, but at the end, we have a situation where, Israel is claiming there to be carrying out a war of self-defense, that they've been attacked, their people are under threat. And the same way from the Lebanese side, you're going to be hearing these claims. But the difference here is that Israel is talking as a state, while in Lebanon you have a group that has declared war. And we know in Lebanon we have a division. We have half the Lebanese parties today are against what Hezbollah is doing and have been calling for Hezbollah to stop firing on Israel. And we know the political divide inside Lebanon, which will play in Israel's favor. Hezbollah being branded as a terrorist organization by many countries in the West, and it is a war against Iran through its proxy, which is Hezbollah.
Riyad Khawaji, military expert advisor to Al Arabiya Network. Always good to get your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, for more overseas reaction to the situation in Lebanon, I'm joined now by the former UK ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor, Sir Mark Lyle Grant. Thank you for making time for us. This is being described as the deadliest day in Lebanon during this most recent year-long build-up of conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. Given what we saw happening over the course of last week and over the weekend, did you anticipate it getting so bad today?
Well, I think it's inevitable once Israel had established a new war goal of permitting or allowing the 60,000 evacuated citizens to return to their homes in northern Israel, because clearly those people are not going to return unless they feel safe from Hezbollah rocket attacks. So I think the intensification that we've seen coming from Israel, because the escalation is coming from Israel rather than from Hezbollah, is designed to try and achieve that new war goal that Netanyahu has set out.
Well, and indeed in the last few hours, Netanyahu himself saying the words, he believes the balance of power is indeed shifting in the north of Israel, thanks to these recent actions by Israel to try and redress some of that balance. What, though, do you say to some sort of analysis that this is only going to further escalate and create bigger reprisals from Hezbollah or indeed from Iran?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a very big risk, and the biggest risk we've seen of escalation since the attacks by Hamas a year ago nearly. Because provided that Hezbollah can still fire rockets into northern Israel, and they've shown the capacity even today to be able to still do that, despite the fact that many of their commanders have been killed and injured by the recent attacks, the fact their communications has been destroyed, a lot of their military infrastructure has been destroyed, they have continued to fire rockets into Israel. And I don't think an intensification of the air bombardment alone by Israel will prevent them continuing to do that. Indeed, I would expect, as we're beginning to see, some of the militias in places like Syria and Iraq that are allied to Hezbollah and Iran will themselves join in trying to fire rockets into Israel. So the question now is, does Israel have to escalate even further beyond the bombardments we've seen in the last 48 hours in order to achieve this new goal that they've set out?
Indeed, let's think for a moment about some of those pro-Iranian militias you were just talking about there, because it's not just from Hezbollah in Lebanon that we're seeing this type of attack. There are other countries, the so-called Islamic resistance in Iraq, as you mentioned, that are firing back. But in terms of Iran and its relationship to Hezbollah, what did you make of the comments that we got this was from an Iranian news agency over the weekend, regards to the news that a top Hezbollah commander was killed in Friday's airstrike attacks. The Iranian foreign minister saying that Iran is not planning a direct act of revenge and, quote, this incident is a matter for Hezbollah. It will certainly show an appropriate reaction in due course. How do you read that diplomatically? Is it hands-off or is it a message from Iran?
It is a little bit hands-off. I think Iran clearly does not want to escalate this conflict with Israel. They know that if they were to launch some sort of full-scale attack on Israel, Israel would defeat them. They are happy to use the proxies like Hezbollah, like the Houthis, some of the militias, as you mentioned, in Iraq, to damage and weaken Israel. But I don't think they want an escalation. Hezbollah aren't in a position to escalate. Iran doesn't want it. America is desperate to prevent wider escalation. Really, it's only Netanyahu and his cabinet who have a potential interest in escalating this conflict further with Hezbollah.
Indeed, and it seems that even the US, one of Israel's closest allies, is trying to call for restraint, or at least diplomatically try and rein Israel in, saying they want anything but military escalation. But are you seeing that having any effect at all on the way Israel is conducting itself?
Well, not really, no. I think the American administration has done a very good job over the last 12 months in acting as a deterrent against escalation into a full-scale regional war. We saw them sending very strong messages privately and publicly to Iran right at the beginning of this conflict 12 months ago. They've moved a fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think they've done a good job. But it's clear that in the last few months, the Biden administration is getting very frustrated with Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet because he is not taking their advice. He is not compromising on the possibility of a ceasefire in Gaza, and he is not listening to their warnings not to escalate matters with Hezbollah. So although I don't expect the Americans to change their fundamental position of support to Israel, and how could Joe Biden do that 6 weeks before an American election, but nonetheless, there is no doubt there's deep frustration in private now in Washington at the way Israel is conducting this conflict.
Indeed, I've spoken to analysts from the US over the past week or so who've actually suggested that the timing of this strategically from Israel may have been timed within the sort of the 6-week window of the US general election. I mean, that might be too specific in terms of when exactly they've timed it, but just in that sense of by the Biden administration not actually being able to do much right now. I mean, how planned do you think it was?
Well, I think they were always planning to sort of escalate against Hezbollah when the sort of ferocity of the fighting in Gaza was on the decline. I think what we've seen is maybe a slight acceleration of the timing because it does seem that there is some truth in the suggestions that Hezbollah were beginning to discover that some of their pagers and their walkie-talkies had been tampered with, and so the Israelis exploded those devices maybe earlier than they had planned. But having done that, they're clearly wanting to take advantage of the damage that's been done to Hezbollah structures and command and control to sort of maximize the opportunity to push the Hezbollah away from the Israeli border, if possible, north of the Litani River. I'm not sure, however, that they will be able to achieve that without escalating further by a land incursion into Lebanon. And that, of course, would be a whole new avenue opening up.
Indeed, it would, fighting on both fronts, if you like, two fronts at the moment, Israel. And let's think a moment about Netanyahu and his government domestically, because externally it's almost like Israel saying we're going to conduct ourselves in the way that we deem appropriate in order to keep A, Hamas, and B, Hezbollah at bay for the safety, they say, of Israeli citizens. Now, in terms of the war aims of what was been going on in Gaza for the last year, Netanyahu was adamant that the war goals were bring the hostages home, get Hamas out, root and branch, and anybody who was responsible for October 7th. Then with Hezbollah and Lebanon, what's currently happening, he says the goal is to get those 60,000 or so displaced Israelis in the north of Israel back to their homes. He hasn't succeeded so far in that first branch in Gaza. Those war goals have not been achieved. Do you think this second front, what is happening up with the Lebanese border, he's trying to prove to the domestic public at home in Israel that he can achieve some war goals?
Well, I think that's one of the fundamental problems that Netanyahu has faced. He established 12 months ago, right at the start, in response to the terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli citizens, unachievable war goals. He established these goals, as you mentioned. he hasn't been able to achieve them and probably never was going to be able to achieve them. So he's had to sort of double down, because not only are there still hostages being held by Hamas, Hamas has still got some military capacity, and he's now set this additional war goal, as you say. I don't think as a distraction. It's always been an ambition, of course, of the Israelis to allow their citizens to live anywhere within the territory of Israel. But nonetheless, I think he is finding it extremely difficult to achieve these goals, but it hasn't held him back from setting new ones and escalating the conflict further.
In terms of the UN, let's go back to the diplomatic experience that you have such a vast amount of. And, you know, some have accused the UN recently, especially UN Security Council, of being somewhat toothless when it comes to dealing with these conflicts, especially due to divisions over what's been happening in Ukraine the past few years. Can they do anything with regard to what's currently happening to try and de-escalate tensions?
I don't think the UN Security Council can do much, to be honest. The UN system as a whole is obviously doing a lot, and in terms of the sort of humanitarian relief for people in Gaza, etc. But the UN Security Council is heavily divided, both on Ukraine, as you mentioned, that conflict, and in the Middle East, it's America that is vetoing any attempts to resolve the conflict. I don't think that will change. It's always been a feature of the United Nations that when the sort of fundamental interests of one of the major powers, the permanent members, is at stake, then the system does get paralyzed. It doesn't mean there's no activity, but it does mean that it's unlikely that the Security Council itself will play a role. The people who are playing a role, as we know, are the Americans, the Qataris, the Egyptians. They have much more influence on events on the ground than the international community does at this stage.
Yeah, and it would be remiss of us to talk to you and not ask you whether you thought the UK would have any impact at all when it came to this.
Well, the reality is it doesn't have a huge amount. The new Labour government in the United Kingdom that's been in power now for 3 months, they have shifted the position slightly on this conflict. As we've seen, they've suspended some of the arms sales licenses to Israel. They're no longer supporting Israel in the court case brought by South Africa in the International Court of Justice. And they've resumed humanitarian aid assistance to UNRWA, the UN body that helps Palestinian refugees in Gaza. So there have been some subtle shifts of policy, but I wouldn't pretend that they have actually changed anything on the ground or have much influence on the Israeli government. It is the Americans that, in the West at least, have the only influence and authority over Israel. But of course, in the run-up to a general election and in America, they are not about to cut off all ties with Israel.
No, and in terms of other forms of international pressure, of course, there's been that arrest warrant against Netanyahu over previous months that's being challenged, or at least through the court system. But in terms of war crimes alleged to have happened or to be carried out by Israel as well, when you think about things like sanctioning weapons sales and stuff like that, in terms of war crimes, there has been allegations that even the exploding pagers and the exploding walkie-talkies we saw, those attacks that happened across Lebanon last week, despite the fact that Israel has not claimed direct responsibility for them, they could be constituted something of a war crime because of the way they happened in civilian places, and people standing by may have been injured as well. Could you see that adding more pressure on Israel at the moment in terms of their behaviour, those types of charges?
Well, certainly you're right. The Volker Turk, who is the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, said very clearly in the UN Security Council meeting on Friday night that the exploding pagers was a violation of international law. Now, many of the UN system have already said that over the last 12 months, Israel has committed multiple breaches of international humanitarian law by the way they have conducted their self-defense against Hamas. But that has not had any impact on the Israeli government. And actually, it's more likely to lead to Netanyahu doubling down, because he knows that once this military phase is over in whatever way, because at some point it will come to an end, not only his position in Israel, his government is likely to fall and he will be out of power, but there is a high risk that he will be arrested or put in prison or unable to travel internationally because of these international arrest warrants. So he is more protected in the position when he's actually prime minister than he will be when this phase of the conflict is over.
And I'm just interested to get your view on how Lebanese politicians are dealing with this at the moment, how Lebanon is dealing with this situation with Hezbollah in the country as well.
Well, the Lebanese government has been in a difficult position over the last 20 years with respect to Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, as well as being a terrorist organization as far as the West is concerned, is also a political force within the Lebanese state. And therefore, when Israel asks the Lebanese government to get Hezbollah under control, they don't really have the capacity to do that. And unfortunately, Lebanon is one of those countries, Somalia, for instance, Sudan is another, where the sort of informal forces, the militias, are more powerful than the Lebanese armed forces. So they're not in a position to discipline or control Hezbollah in any way. So it must be deeply frustrating for non-Hezbollah members of the Lebanese government, because they have allowed to grow, if you like, or that they haven't been able to prevent the growth of a state within a state in Lebanon. But that ship has sailed, and I just don't think the Lebanese state is strong enough to be able to do anything about that in the near future.
It's been really good to get your perspectives. Thank you for sharing them. Sir Mark Lyle Grant from the UK.
Thank you, Rosanna.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews and debate. Until then, goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
In a journey that is rich in its content and substantiated by its details, from primitive cave drawings to the engraving of letters on stones, it set out. Writing was invented, and the alphabet shortly followed. And is the case in all journeys. What is new is the title. When you are facing a manuscript, it is inevitable that time will simply fleet you. As you enter a meditative state, as you wipe the dust off of it, the fragrance of history captivates you. You begin to visualize the very fingertips of those who created this fine craft that they excelled in. The first calligraphers excelled in their precision and artwork skills. They added diacritics, and with ink and tools they wrote it all out, and they decorated them with their motifs. These are the messages of light, passed on through the history of Arab manuscripts. Research and experimentation are a part of human nature. We did not stop developing new forms of paper after finding one plant that worked. Rather, we sought out other materials, which were skins from animals. The desired goal from this material was to be used in parallel with papyrus. The The Arabs of the pre-Islamic era and the advent of Islam used these skins as a material for writing, and it would become vastly more common and widespread with time. Parchment was one of the most important writing materials, alongside papyrus, during the ancient eras. Middle Eastern civilizations used ordinary leather to write on before they were able to achieve a steady production of parchment. The oldest text that was written on leather was found in Egypt, and it dates back to the 15th century BC. For Mesopotamia, the oldest text written on hide or leather dates back to the 9th century BC. The use of leather took off from these two cultural centers to spread and reach the country of Phoenicia and the other people groups in the eastern Mediterranean region. Historical evidence indicates that man started using tanned animal hides over 30,000 years ago. Leather was mentioned in several surahs that are present in the Holy Quran, such as the surahs of Al-Hajj, An-Nisa, As-Zumar, Fussilat, and An-Nahl, where Allah stated, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful."
والله جعل لكم من بيوتكم سكنا وجعل لكم من جلود الأنعام بيوتا تستخفونها يوم ضعنكم ويوم إقامتكم ومن أصوافها وأوبارها وأشعارها أثاثا ومتاعا إلى حين.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. Allah Almighty stated, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful."
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء ومن يضلل الله فما له من هاد.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. As for how the word leather is written in tandem with the word parchment in the Quran, the Almighty stated, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful."
والطور وكتاب مسطور في رق منشور والبيت المعمور والسقف المرفوع والبحر المسجور إن عذاب ربك لواقع.
Allah Almighty has spoken the truth. Leather that is prepared for writing is referred to as parchment, and they mostly come from the hides of the buffaloes, cows, and deer. Sheepskin was the most commonly used source of parchment, to the extent of it decorating the covers of manuscripts after they were decorated and gilded. The importance of leather was not limited to writing alone. Its various uses necessitated the existence of a specialized leather industry known as leather tanning, which is still present in current times. Leather tanning became widespread in the Arabian Peninsula, and the most famous tanners were found in Najran, Jarash, Saada, and Sana'a. To make these hides suitable for writing, they had to go through several stages of preparation. It started with the removal of the hair from its roots and removing the leftover residue by using lime water or any other preservative. The hide would be tightened on a suitable wooden frame, as this stretching process was what distinguished parchment from regular leather. After the treatment process was completed, it would be left to dry. Distinguishing the two sides of parchment is quite simple, as one side contains the hair while the other contains the flesh. Writing took place on the smoother surface. The dimensions of parchment varied according to the size of the animal that the material was taken from. There are many types of leather that were used for writing that depended on how it was sourced and the methods of how it was prepared. Known kinds of parchment were Rak, Al-Adim, and Al-Qadim. Rak, which was usually derived from deer, was one of the best and most widely used leathers for writing. It was known for being lightweight and delicate. It was made from the hide of young calves, lambs, and deer. The Arabs of the pre-Islamic era were familiar with parchment and used it to write charters, testimonies, and financial certificates. Parchment was still very prominent even after the advent of Islam, and it was one of the materials that the verses of the Holy Quran were written upon. In his book, Subh al-Asha, Al-Kalkashandi states that the companions of the Prophet unanimously agreed to write the Holy Quran on parchment due to its longevity. Thus, the use of parchments became prominent in various aspects of life that involved writing, and tanneries began to spread in many Arab cities. The most prominent of these parchments were the Kufa parchments, which were tanned with dates. This gave it softness and plasticity that surpassed other leathers. In addition to this, there were the parchments of Al-Basra, Wasit, and other Arab cities. Despite its characteristics of how easy it was to preserve and its longevity, the fact that it could be washed and have what was written on it be erased constituted a set of flaws that could not be overlooked. Especially with the increase of papyrus production, which competed with parchment with how lightweight it was, how easy it was to carry, and how difficult it was to forge. There were advantageous differences between papyrus and parchment, placing the latter in the second place as a writing material after papyrus proved to be superior. Our libraries are stocked with manuscripts written on leather. This is the clearest evidence of that papyrus did not eliminate the existence of parchment that was made of leather. During those times, both progress and a need for improvement drove humans to discover paper. This elevated creating manuscripts to another level, facilitated its journey across time, and allowed it to shine through with anticipation of learning about what they had contained.